Hey friends, settle in, get comfortable. Because tonight we're stepping into a 250-room mansion in the North Carolina mountains in the autumn of 1900. Into everything it actually took to keep a family like this one comfortable through a single day and night. A small wooden board hidden behind the kitchens, wired to nearly every bedroom upstairs, so that a single tug on a bell pull could summon help before the family had even finished the thought. A heated indoor swimming pool, a gymnasium, and a 2-lane bowling alley, tucked away in the basement of a house built in 1895, decades before anyone else in the country thought to build such a thing at home. A house with 250 rooms and 43 bathrooms that still needed a young woman on her knees in front of a cold iron range at 4 a.m, just to get a single one of them warm. Tonight holds a great many more of these, folded quietly into the story of one particular family's very ordinary, very extraordinary day and night. If a story like this one has ever helped you drift off, leaving a like and subscribing helps this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs nothing, and it means more than you might think. While you're here, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe a quiet evening somewhere in Ohio, a cozy village somewhere in the English countryside. Leave it in the comments. I genuinely love reading every single one. All right, love, let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest. Let's begin. It is 4 a.m. in the mountains of western North Carolina, and Biltmore House is completely dark. Not a single window shows a light. From the long approach road, past the trees that George Vanderbilt planted himself, the house looks like something asleep, a limestone shape against a black sky, silent the way only a very large building can be silent, which is to say, not silent at all if you happen to be standing inside it. Because inside, 3 floors below the room where George Vanderbilt is still sleeping, a kitchen fire is already being built. A woman named Sarah, one of the kitchen maids, is on her knees in front of an iron range that has gone cold overnight, working ash out with a small metal scoop, and in a few minutes there will be a fire lit under this house that will not go out again until well past midnight. Most people upstairs would never have reason to learn her name. That is the strange arithmetic of a house like this one. So many rooms and more than 30 people employed to keep it running on any given day. And a family of 3, George, his wife Edith, and their small daughter Cornelia, whose entire experience of the place is meant to feel effortless, whose fires are simply lit, whose water is simply hot, whose mornings simply arrive gowned and pressed and warmed, as though the house does this on its own. It does not do this on its own. A small wooden board sits mounted in the servants' hall, low-ceilinged, whitewashed, tucked behind the kitchens where no guest ever wandered by accident. It is called an annunciator, and it is connected by wire to a small bell pull in nearly every important room upstairs. When someone in the Louis XVI room tugs a tasseled cord beside the bed, a little flag drops on this board downstairs, a number swings into view, and a bell rings just loud enough to be heard by whoever happens to be nearby. Right now, at 4:30 a.m, in the hush of this particular working corner of the house, the board is still. All 30-some flags sit flush and quiet. That will not last. By 6, this board will have swung into motion a dozen times before most of the house has even opened its eyes, and a housemaid named Ruth, whose entire job for the next hour is essentially reading, will glance up from her mending each time a flag drops, note the number, and know, without anyone telling her twice, exactly which room needs her and roughly what for. Here is the thing about a house this size. Nobody upstairs presses a button and waits, the way you might imagine. The system runs on anticipation as much as response. By the time George Vanderbilt's feet touch the floor of his bedroom this morning, his valet will already be 2 steps ahead of him, because the valet has memorized not just his employer's schedule but his employer's mood. The small tells that mean today calls for the grey tweed and not the brown. That a letter arrived late last night and George will want to read it before he wants his coffee. The best household staff in a house like this one were not reactive. They were quietly, almost eerily, predictive. George Vanderbilt's room sits on the 2nd floor, and it is worth pausing here, because his bedroom is not the grand gilded chamber you might be picturing. It is warm and rather bookish, dark wood panelling, a fireplace that has been kept lit through the night by someone who slipped in and out without waking him. And beside the bed, on the small table, 3 books stacked in the order he's currently reading them. George Vanderbilt owned something close to 22,000 volumes by the time this house was finished, more than most private libraries in the country, and he did not simply display them. He read them, constantly, restlessly, the way some men smoke. His valet, a quiet Englishman named Edwin Warren, is already in the dressing room next door, and he is doing something you would not expect. He is not laying out one outfit. He is laying out 4, a riding costume, in case Mr. Vanderbilt decides on an early ride before breakfast, which he sometimes does when the weather is fine. A morning suit for the breakfast room itself, something slightly more formal in case the post brings correspondence that requires him to receive a caller unexpectedly, and, folded separately, a change of linen for later in the afternoon, because a gentleman of George Vanderbilt's standing might change clothing 3 or 4 times over the course of a single day, and the wardrobe upstairs has been built quite literally, with rooms and rooms of closet space to accommodate exactly that. Edwin checks the crease in the trousers with his thumb. He checks the shine on a pair of boots that were already polished last night, checking them again anyway, because habits like this one are not really about the boots. They're about control in a house where almost nothing is allowed to go visibly wrong. Down the hall and around a corner, in a suite of rooms with a very different character, soft colours, a smaller and more personal scale, Edith Vanderbilt's lady's maid is doing something similar. Her name was Noémie, French, brought over specifically for this role, because a lady's maid in a house like this one was expected to understand not just hair and dress, but fashion itself. The difference between what was correct last season and what is correct now. She is standing in front of an open jewellery case this morning, and she's not simply picking something pretty. She already knows, from a conversation the evening before, that Edith is expecting a caller by early afternoon, a woman from a prominent Asheville family, and the earrings she selects, small and unshowy, are chosen specifically because they say we did not try very hard for you, when the truth is someone tried enormously hard, an hour before the sun came up. I find something quietly moving in that. So much of what looked effortless in a house like this was actually the opposite of effortless. It was labour disguised as ease. And that disguise, that particular kind of invisible work, threads through kitchens, hallways, the folding of a napkin nobody upstairs will ever think twice about. 3 floors down and the opposite end of the house from where the family sleeps, the kitchens are fully awake now, and they are louder than anything happening upstairs. Biltmore was built with several separate kitchens rather than one, a division of labour that sounds almost absurd until you understand the scale of what they were feeding. There is a main kitchen, cavernous, with a coal range along one wall, long enough that 2 cooks can work it at once without bumping elbows. There is a rotisserie kitchen next door, built specifically for roasting meat, because roasting meat properly requires heat and smoke that you do not want mixing with the delicate work of pastry. And there is a pastry kitchen, cooler, quieter, its own separate room, where a woman named Agnes is this morning working butter into flour with the flat of her hand, because a good pastry cook in 1900 trusted her palms more than any recipe card. The chef, a Frenchman whose temperament was, by every account, roughly what you would expect, has already reviewed this morning's breakfast menu with the housekeeper, and there is a small disagreement happening in French near the pantry door about whether the trout arrived fresh enough to serve this morning, or whether it ought to wait for dinner. This is not the kind of drama that ever reaches upstairs. It is settled here, quietly, by people who understand that George Vanderbilt will never once in his life know that a disagreement about trout occurred. What he will know is that breakfast, when it arrives, is simple. Dinner at Biltmore was a production, courses and wine and careful choreography, but breakfast was the one meal of the day that stayed genuinely informal, almost domestic, coffee and eggs and fruit and a little cold meat, laid out so that family and any house guests could serve themselves at whatever hour suited them, rather than everyone gathering at a fixed time the way they would for dinner. There is something almost tender about that choice, small and easy to overlook, in a house otherwise built so consistently around formality. Even the Vanderbilts, it seems, wanted one meal a day that did not feel like a performance. While the food is coming together downstairs, a footman is crossing the entrance hall upstairs carrying a small silver tray, and on it, a single folded note. It arrived by messenger from Asheville a few minutes ago, before the family is even properly awake, and it is addressed to Edith. The housekeeper, a formidable and extremely capable woman named Emily King, has already glanced at the outside of the envelope, recognised the hand, and made a judgment call that this note is important enough to bring up now rather than let sit on the breakfast tray with the rest of the morning's correspondence. For now, it simply sits there on its little tray, being carried up a staircase toward a woman who has not yet had her coffee. One floor above the family's private rooms, in the nursery wing, a very different morning is unfolding. Cornelia Vanderbilt, 3 years old this particular year, is awake, and, by the sound of it, not entirely pleased about something, and her English nurse is doing the quiet negotiating that nurses have always done with small children who have very strong opinions about socks. Cornelia is the only child in this enormous house, growing up with, in a certain sense, no other children at all, which is its own peculiar kind of childhood, equal parts extraordinary and lonely. Her nursery is bright, filled with toys shipped from New York and Paris, a rocking horse in the corner that she has already declared too small for her, though she still climbs onto it most mornings anyway. Her mother makes a point, whenever her own schedule allows it, of coming up to the nursery before the day properly begins, and this morning is one of those mornings. Edith Vanderbilt, in a dressing gown, her hair not yet fully done, sits on the edge of a small chair clearly built for someone much shorter than she is, and lets her daughter show her, in exhaustive detail, exactly what is wrong with today's socks. There is nothing performative in this moment. Nobody is watching. It is simply a mother and a daughter, in a house so large that most of it will go entirely unused today, choosing to spend 10 minutes of an impossibly full schedule on socks. I like this detail more than almost anything else in this story. For all the formality downstairs, for all the calling cards and the correct earrings and the careful choreography of a house built to impress, here is Edith Vanderbilt sitting on a tiny chair at 6:30 in the morning, entirely undone, entirely a mother, in a room nobody outside the family will ever see. Let's talk about stairs for a moment, because stairs turn out to be one of the more honest things in this entire house. Biltmore has a grand staircase, a sweeping spiral of limestone that rises through 4 floors beneath a chandelier that drops down through the centre of it, like something out of a dream. And if you have ever seen a photograph of the house, this is very likely the staircase you saw. It is meant to be seen. It is meant to make an entrance feel like an event. But running parallel to it, hidden behind unmarked doors, is an entirely separate set of stairs, narrower, plainer, built purely for function, and this is the staircase that most of the 30-some people working in this house use dozens of times a day. A housemaid carrying an armful of linen does not walk the grand staircase. A footman rushing a forgotten item up to a guest room does not walk the grand staircase. The house was designed quite deliberately, so that 2 entirely different versions of daily life could move through the same building at the same time, without ever really crossing paths. Guests experience one Biltmore, staff experience another, and the stairs are where that separation is most literal, 2 spines running through the same body, only one of them ever meant to be looked at. Edwin finishes with George's clothing and knocks once before entering the bedroom. George Vanderbilt is up now, and the 2 of them move through the morning routine with the kind of wordless efficiency that comes from years of practice. Hot water for shaving, already carried up and waiting. A conversation, brief and mostly one-sided, about the day's schedule, a ride before breakfast after all, the weather having turned out finer than expected. Edwin lays out the riding clothes without being asked twice. Down in the breakfast room, Edith has come down ahead of her husband, and Emily King, the housekeeper, hands her the folded note from Asheville along with her coffee. Edith reads it once quickly and then again more slowly. It is from a family friend, informing her, with more apology than the situation probably requires, that a guest expected tomorrow evening for the small house party already being arranged will now be arriving this afternoon instead, a full day early, due to a change in train schedules that could not be helped. This is not a catastrophe, I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to make this sound like a crisis, and it simply is not one. Nobody in 1900 America built a house like Biltmore without also building the systems to absorb a surprise like this one without visible strain. But it does mean a bedroom that was meant to be finished by tomorrow evening now needs to be entirely ready by this afternoon, fires laid, linens aired, flowers arranged, and Edith, without any particular drama in her voice, simply asks Emily King to see to it, and Emily King, without any particular drama in her own voice, says of course, and that more or less is the entire crisis. It will be handled by roughly 4 in the afternoon by people whose names the arriving guest will likely never learn. We will check back in on that room later. For now, notice how quietly the problem was solved. That quietness is, in its own way, the whole point of everything we are talking about tonight. George comes down for breakfast in his riding clothes, kisses his wife on the top of the head, mentions the fine weather, and the two of them eat together in a room filled with morning light, at a table set for 2 even though it could easily seat 12, because most mornings, before guests arrive, this enormous house is really just a home for 3 people and whoever happens to be visiting. Cornelia, breakfast finished upstairs with her nurse, is brought down briefly to say good morning, in the particular ritual way that children of this era and class were brought to their parents for short, formal, affectionate visits, rather than raised underfoot all day the way we might expect now. She curtsies badly, on purpose, because it makes her father laugh, and then she is taken back upstairs, and breakfast continues. I want to slow down here for just a moment, because there is a temptation telling a story like this one to make the Vanderbilts feel distant, gilded, almost unreal. But this scene, 2 parents and a small daughter, morning light, a badly performed curtsy that gets a laugh anyway, is about as ordinary as family life gets. The size of the house does not change that. It just makes the ordinary things happen inside an extraordinary frame. After breakfast, George Vanderbilt does what he does most mornings when there is no pressing estate business waiting for him, which is disappear into the library. I want to spend some real time here because I think this room tells you more about him than almost anything else in the house. The library at Biltmore holds roughly 10,000 volumes on its shelves, though his personal collection across the whole estate runs far larger than that, closer to 22,000 books by some counts, on subjects ranging from horticulture to architecture to Italian poetry, and George Vanderbilt read an almost unbelievable amount of it. There are letters and diary entries from people who knew him, describing a man who kept careful lists of every book he finished, year by year, a habit that suggests less a wealthy man collecting objects and more a genuinely restless mind trying to keep pace with itself. Its ceiling was painted by an Italian artist, cherubs and clouds and allegorical figures drifting overhead, the kind of ceiling that would ordinarily dominate a space entirely. And yet the thing you notice, standing in this room, is not the ceiling. It is the chairs, worn slightly at the arms, positioned near the fireplace at angles that suggest actual use rather than display, a scattering of bookmarks tucked into volumes left mid-read on the lower shelves where a person, rather than a decorator, would have left them. This was not a library built to be photographed. It happened to be beautiful, and it was also unmistakably lived in. George settles into his usual chair this morning with a book on landscape architecture, something he cares about almost as much as literature itself, given how much of his life and his fortune went into shaping the grounds around this house. A fire has already been laid and lit in the fireplace, though nobody saw who did it. That is simply how the morning works. He will sit here for perhaps 40 minutes before the day's other obligations pull him away, and during that time this room, despite being one of the largest private libraries in the country, will contain exactly 1 person. Down in the servants' hall, meanwhile, the day's real machinery is running at full speed, and it is worth understanding how that machinery was organized, because it was organized with almost military precision, a structure inherited largely from English great house traditions and adapted in small ways to the particular scale and character of this specifically American estate. At the top of the household staff, beneath the family itself, sat 2 figures who rarely if ever did the physical labor of the house themselves, but who were responsible for nearly everything that happened within it. The butler oversaw the male staff and the public, formal side of household life, wine, silver, the dining room, the correct order in which courses arrived at table, the seating of guests, the general choreography of anything that happened where a guest might be watching. The housekeeper, Emily King in this case, oversaw the female staff and the domestic, private side, linen, cleaning schedules, the preparation of bedrooms, supplies, standards, the thousand small decisions that guests never saw, but that determined whether their stay felt luxurious or merely adequate. Beneath these two, a hierarchy fanned outward. Footmen, chosen partly for their height and bearing because appearance mattered enormously in public-facing roles, served meals and answered doors and carried messages through the house. Housemaids like Ruth cleaned and made beds and tended fires in guest rooms, always working around the guests' schedules rather than the other way, slipping into rooms while their occupants were at breakfast or out walking the grounds so that a bed might simply appear made without anyone ever witnessing the making of it. Kitchen maids like Sarah worked under the chef, an entire separate hierarchy within the kitchens themselves, and at the very top of the personal service ranks, closest to the family and therefore holding a strange kind of privileged intimacy that outranked their formal position, sat the valet and the lady's maid, Edwin and Noemi, the two people in this entire enormous staff who saw George and Edith Vanderbilt at their most unguarded, undressed, unwell, ungracious on a bad day, and who were trusted, implicitly, to say nothing about any of it, ever, to anyone. This is one of the odder truths about household hierarchy in a house like this one. Rank was not simply about how close you stood to the family. It was about two competing kinds of closeness, formal proximity and physical, private proximity, and the two did not always align. A butler outranked a lady's maid in the household's formal order, but it was the lady's maid who knew what Edith Vanderbilt's face looked like without powder on it, who knew when she had cried the night before, who knew things about her that the butler, for all his authority, would never be told. Emily King moves through the guest room that needs to be finished by this afternoon, checking the fire, checking the linen, running a gloved finger along the top of a picture frame to check for dust that very likely is not there because Emily King does not permit dust that has any business existing. A vase of flowers arrives, cut from the greenhouse an hour earlier, and she adjusts their position on the mantel twice before she is satisfied. This room will be ready hours ahead of schedule. It usually is. That is, in the end, the entire point of Emily King. There is a room just off the dining room that most guests never even registered as a room at all, a narrow, windowless space called the butler's pantry, and if the library was George Vanderbilt's soul, this small pantry was something closer to the house's nervous system. Here, behind a closed door, the butler and his footman kept the silver, hundreds of pieces of it, forks and spoons and serving pieces, in patterns matched precisely to the level of formality a given meal required, each one polished not once but continually, because silver left even briefly untouched in a humid climate like western North Carolina begins to tarnish within days. There is a particular smell to a room like this, metal polish and beeswax, and the faint mineral scent of silver itself, and a particular sound too, the soft repetitive rasp of cloth against metal, going on for hours at a stretch, performed by men whose forearms, by the end of a career in service, developed a kind of muscle memory specific to this one motion and no other. The china lived here too, stacked with almost superstitious care, each pattern reserved for specific occasions, and the crystal and the linen tablecloths ironed to a stiffness that could nearly stand on its own. This pantry was, in effect, a vault, though nothing in it was ever locked away from use the way jewels might be. It existed to be used constantly and to look, every single time, as though it had never been used at all. I keep coming back to that particular contradiction tonight, the idea of something being used relentlessly and yet always appearing untouched. It runs through nearly everything in this house. The fires that are always lit but never seen being built, the beds that are always made but never seen being made, the silver that is handled every day by dozens of hands and yet arrives at the table gleaming as though it has just been unwrapped for the first time. Outside, the estate itself is beginning its own version of the same quiet performance. Biltmore was never meant to be simply a house. It was meant to be a self-sustaining world, and by mid-morning, wagons are already moving along the estate roads, bringing in what the house will need before the day is finished. Milk and cream from the dairy herd George Vanderbilt bred with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. Vegetables and cut flowers from the walled garden, where a team of gardeners has been working since well before dawn, because a formal garden this size does not maintain itself on good intentions. Firewood, split and stacked, enough of it that keeping this house heated through even a mild North Carolina winter required something close to an industrial operation. The greenhouse deserves its own moment here, because it is one of the more beautiful working parts of the estate, a long glass structure kept warm year-round, where orchids and ferns and out-of-season flowers were grown specifically so that the house could have fresh blooms in nearly any month, in nearly any room, without ever seeming to strain for them. A gardener named Thomas cuts a small armful of white flowers this particular morning, destined for a vase in the guest room that Emily King is preparing, and neither man knows the other's name, though their work this morning is quietly connected. That happens constantly in a house this size. Dozens of small invisible collaborations, none of the participants ever quite meeting. Back inside, in the basement laundry, the scale of what this house required becomes almost comic if you let yourself think about it too long. Sheets for every occupied bedroom, changed with a regularity that would have seemed almost excessive to most American households of the same era. Table linens for every meal. Towels, and underneath all of it, mountains of more personal laundry. Shirts and underclothes and stockings, washed by hand in enormous tubs, wrung through mechanical rollers, hung to dry in a drying room heated specifically for the purpose, since North Carolina weather could not always be relied upon. The laundresses working this room today, 3 of them, moving in a rhythm so practiced it barely requires conversation, will handle something in the range of hundreds of individual pieces before the day is finished, and every single one of those pieces will arrive back in its owner's room folded, pressed, and entirely without evidence of the hours it took to get there. This, I think, might be the single most thankless job in the entire house, and also, in its own strange way, one of the most essential. Nobody remembers the laundress. Everybody notices instantly a wrinkled shirt. I want to pause the household routine for a few minutes and talk about something that made Biltmore genuinely strange for its time, which is how modern it actually was underneath all that French Renaissance stone and turret work. From the outside, the house looks like it belongs in the Loire Valley, borrowed almost wholesale from centuries-old French chateaux, and that illusion was entirely intentional. But step inside, and you find a building that was, for 1895, almost startlingly advanced. Biltmore had electric lighting throughout, hundreds of fixtures, at a time when much of rural America, and even a good portion of urban America, was still lit by gas or oil. It had indoor plumbing on a scale almost nobody else in the country could claim, something in the neighborhood of 43 bathrooms, an extraordinary number for a private residence in this era, when many wealthy households still relied on a handful of shared facilities and a great deal of carried water. It had 2 electric elevators, one for the family and guests, a smaller service elevator for staff and goods, sparing footmen the exhausting daily work of hauling trunks and trays up 4 flights by hand. It even had a rudimentary telephone and communication system linking parts of the house together, along with the mechanical bell system we already talked about. None of this was shown off the way you might expect. A guest walking through the banquet hall, staring up at the triple-height ceiling and the Flemish tapestries and the organ loft at one end, was not thinking about plumbing. That was rather the point. The technology was meant to disappear into the comfort it created, hot water simply being there when you turned a tap, light simply being there when you needed it, rather than announcing itself as a marvel. George Vanderbilt, from what we know of him, was genuinely fascinated by these systems, corresponded about them, cared about efficiency and engineering nearly as much as he cared about landscape design or literature. But he built a house where all of that fascination stayed hidden behind stone walls, carved to look 400 years old. There is something almost funny about that if you sit with it. An enormously wealthy, forward-thinking, technologically curious man, building himself the most convincing fake medieval castle that modern engineering could produce. By early afternoon, the early guest has arrived, a little ahead of even the revised schedule. And the house absorbs her the way it absorbs most surprises, smoothly and almost entirely out of her own view. A carriage brings her from the train station in Asheville, up the long approach road, past the trees and the deliberately obscured first view of the house that George Vanderbilt insisted on, so that a visitor's first glimpse of Biltmore would be sudden and overwhelming rather than gradual. Footmen appear at the door before she has even fully stepped down. Her trunks are carried up the back stairs, not the grand ones, while she herself is led up the grand staircase, and by the time she reaches the room Emily King finished hours ahead of schedule, her belongings are already there waiting, unpacked in most cases before she has even removed her hat, her gowns hung, her smaller items arranged on the dressing table in an order that a good lady's maid, temporarily assigned to assist her for the duration of her stay, has learned to guess at almost instinctively. She has no idea, and will likely never have any idea, that this particular room was originally meant to be ready tomorrow, not today. She simply experiences a house that seems to have been expecting her exactly on time. That gap between what actually happened and what a guest is permitted to perceive is close to the entire argument of tonight's story. Effort converted quietly into ease. Edith receives her downstairs, in the salon, with the kind of warmth that sounds entirely natural and is also, in its way, a skill developed over years, the particular art of making a guest feel like the only thing on your mind when in fact you have already mentally moved on to 17 other tasks before she finished her sentence. The salon where Edith receives her guest sits just off the Winter Garden, and this is a room I want to spend a little time in because it does not look like anything you would expect from a house built in this era. The Winter Garden is essentially indoors and outdoors at once, a glassed atrium with a fountain and a bronze sculpture of children rising from the center of a shallow pool, palm trees and ferns and wicker furniture, arranged as though someone had transplanted a corner of a much warmer climate directly into the middle of a French-style chateau in the Appalachian Mountains. Light pours down through the glass roof, and even in the colder months, the air in here stays soft and slightly humid, carrying the green smell of growing things. This was where the household gathered informally, where afternoon callers were received, where Cornelia was sometimes brought down to play within sight of her mother while the adults talked. It functioned almost like the heart of the house's social life, a room designed less to impress, though it does exactly that anyway, and more to simply be pleasant to sit in for an hour. Edith and her guest talk here for a while, tea brought in by a footman on a tray set with a precision that took Emily King's staff years to perfect, small sandwiches cut into shapes that seem almost wasteful in their delicacy, and the conversation moves the way conversations between old friends move, easily, with long comfortable pauses that neither woman feels compelled to fill. I want to say something here about Edith Vanderbilt specifically, because it would be easy, telling this story, to let her become simply a role, the hostess, the lady of the house, rather than a person. She was, by most accounts from people who knew her, genuinely well-read, genuinely interested in the welfare of the community that had grown up around the estate, later in her life deeply involved in causes ranging from local schools to agricultural cooperatives among the mountain families living near Biltmore. The role of hostess she is performing this afternoon was real work, and she was skilled at it, but it was not the entire measure of who she was. That distinction matters to me. It is easy to flatten a historical figure into the function she served at a dinner table. Edith Vanderbilt was, underneath the earrings and the careful conversation, a specific and complicated person, same as anyone. While the two women talk in the Winter Garden, George has gone out riding, taking advantage of the fine weather he mentioned at breakfast, and this is worth a few minutes too, because the grounds of Biltmore were in their own way as ambitious a project as the house itself. He hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the same landscape architect responsible for Central Park in New York, to design the estate's grounds, and what Olmsted created was not simply a garden, but an entire managed landscape, formal gardens close to the house giving way gradually to more naturalistic plantings further out, and beyond that, thousands of acres of forest that George Vanderbilt turned into one of the earliest large-scale scientific forestry projects in the country, hiring a young forester named Gifford Pinchot, who would go on to lead the entire United States Forest Service, to manage timber on the estate not as a resource to be stripped, but as a system to be sustained. George rides out past the formal gardens this afternoon, past the dairy barn, where the herd he has bred with careful attention produces milk and cream for the house. Past fields being worked by estate farmers, and into the edge of the managed forest itself, where the trees stand in something closer to order than wilderness, though it would take a trained eye to notice the difference. This land, all of it, exists because one man decided that a house needed not just rooms, but an entire self-sustaining world around it, and riding through the edges of that world seems to be, more than almost anything else in his schedule, the part of the day George Vanderbilt actually looks forward to. Somewhere along this same ride, he passes the exact spot, marked in his own memory though by nothing visible on the ground itself, where he first stood with Frederick Law Olmsted years earlier, before a single stone of the house had been laid, looking out over land that was then largely exhausted farmland and cut-over forest, rather than the carefully managed landscape it has since become. Olmsted, by George's own later recollection, was initially rather doubtful about the site's potential, considering much of the original land too poor and too worn out for the kind of grand pleasure grounds Vanderbilt initially imagined, and it was Olmsted himself who first suggested redirecting a significant portion of the property towards serious forestry instead, a suggestion that would eventually reshape not just this one estate, but a meaningful piece of American conservation history. George thinks of that conversation often on rides like this one, a reminder that even his own grandest ambitions were, in the end, improved considerably by someone else's more clear-eyed counsel. A lesson in humility that a man surrounded by this much wealth and this much deference does not always have easy occasion to remember. He is a quieter man out here than he is in the house. Nobody is watching him arrange his face into the correct expression for a host. He simply rides, occasionally stopping to examine a stand of trees or exchange a few words with a farm worker he happens to pass, and for perhaps an hour, the enormous machinery of the household he presides over runs entirely without him, which is, I think, exactly how he prefers it. By late afternoon, the house has begun its slow turn toward evening, and if you want to understand how deliberately Biltmore was built to move a guest's experience through a sequence of moods, you only need to walk from the winter garden to the tapestry gallery, a transition Edith makes now, leading her guest on a slow tour before the light fades. The tapestry gallery is long and narrow, more like a corridor than a room, and it takes its name from 3 enormous Flemish tapestries from the 1500s that hang along one wall, scenes from the story of Vulcan woven centuries earlier in wool and silk, colours softened now by age into something warmer and more muted than they would have been originally. Walking through this gallery feels different from walking through the winter garden. The light is lower, the air feels older, somehow, though of course the building itself was brand new. This was intentional. George Vanderbilt collected these tapestries, and much of the art throughout the house specifically to give Biltmore a sense of inherited history it could not possibly have actually possessed. A house finished in 1895 furnished to feel as though it had stood for centuries. Edith's guest pauses in front of the tapestries the way most visitors do, and Edith, who has given some version of this small tour dozens of times, tells her a little about their history, not performing exactly, but not entirely spontaneous either. Hosting a house like this one required a working knowledge of its own collection that went well beyond simple ownership. Edith could tell you where nearly everything in these rooms had come from, and she generally did, gently when asked. Down below, in the kitchens, the mood has shifted from the relatively relaxed rhythm of breakfast and lunch into something considerably more intense, because dinner at Biltmore was not simply a meal. It was the single largest production the household staged every single day, and preparation for it begins hours before anyone sits down to eat. The chef is moving between the main kitchen and the rotisserie kitchen with the particular controlled urgency of a man responsible for a meal that must arrive at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right order, at exactly the right temperature, for however many people will be seated tonight, a number that has just grown by 1 thanks to this afternoon's early arrival. Sauces are being finished. A joint of meat has been on the rotisserie kitchen spit for hours already, turning slowly, basted at intervals by a kitchen boy whose entire job this afternoon is essentially watching meat rotate and occasionally spooning fat over it. Agnes in the pastry kitchen has moved from the morning's simpler work into something more elaborate, a dessert that will require several more hours of careful, patient labour before it is ready to be seen by anyone upstairs. Beneath the butler's pantry, down a short flight of stairs, the wine cellar holds a collection that George Vanderbilt built with the same seriousness he brought to his library. Thousands of bottles, French and otherwise, organised and aged with real expertise. The butler descends here himself this evening, rather than sending a footman, because selecting wine for a dinner with a guest was considered important enough to warrant his personal attention, and he spends a few minutes running his finger along labels in the dim light before settling on his choices, carrying them back up carefully, the way you would carry something you understood to be genuinely valuable, which, in more than one sense, it was. There is a particular skill to choosing wine for an evening like this one, weighing the fish course against the meat course, considering which of tonight's guests might have particular preferences worth honouring, and Charles has developed, over his years in this role, something close to an instinct for it, rarely needing to consult the household's own careful cellar records before settling on his final selections. He pauses once more near the cellar door to check that the temperature down here remains exactly where it should, a habit so old it barely registers anymore as a conscious decision, before climbing back up toward the warmth and noise of the kitchens above. Upstairs, both George and Edith are changing for dinner, a ritual that happened every single evening regardless of whether guests were present, because dinner at Biltmore, even a quiet family dinner, called for formal dress. Edwin has laid out evening clothes for George. Noemi has been joined by the temporary lady's maid assigned to help the visiting guest, and between the two rooms, an entire quiet choreography of hooks and buttons and careful hair arrangement takes place in the hour before dinner is announced, none of it visible to anyone who is not directly involved in performing it. Dinner is announced a little after 7, and the family and their 2 guests, since a second guest, an older gentleman staying through the week, has also come down, move into the banquet hall together. I have described a few rooms in this house so far, and each of them has its own particular character, but nothing quite prepares you for the banquet hall the first time you actually stand in it. The ceiling rises 7 stories in a sense, barrel-vaulted, dark wood, and at one end an organ loft holds a working pipe organ that could, and sometimes did, provide music during meals. 3 enormous Flemish tapestries hang along the walls here too, part of a set, telling the same story as the ones in the gallery upstairs. A long table runs down the centre of the room, capable of seating 64 people, though tonight, with just 5 at table, it has been set with a shorter arrangement, everyone gathered together near one end, rather than spread the full impractical length of the room. There is something almost theatrical about 5 people eating dinner at one end of a table built for 64, in a room with a 7-story ceiling, and I do not think that theatricality was lost on the Vanderbilts themselves. George Vanderbilt built rooms of a scale that had very little to do with daily comfort, and a great deal to do with what a house like this one was meant to communicate, about permanence, about taste, about a family's arrival into a particular kind of American aristocracy that did not, strictly speaking, exist yet anywhere else in the country in quite this form. The meal itself moves through courses with a rhythm that took years for the household staff to perfect. Soup first, then fish, the trout that survived this morning's small kitchen disagreement, apparently, then a meat course, the joint that has been turning on the rotisserie spit since early afternoon, vegetables from the estate's own gardens, and finally Agnes's dessert, whatever elaborate thing she spent her afternoon constructing, carried in with a small ceremony of its own. Footmen serve from the left, clear from the right, a rule so deeply ingrained that none of them could probably tell you why it exists, only that it does, and that getting it backward would be noticed instantly by anyone trained to notice such things. Conversation at the table is easy, unhurried, the kind of talk that happens between people who know each other well enough not to fill every silence. The older gentleman tells a story about a mutual acquaintance in New York. Edith asks after the younger guest's family, mellowed by an afternoon spent riding through his own forest, is in an easy mood and at one point makes a joke dry enough that it takes the table a beat to realize he was joking at all, and then everyone laughs, including, from somewhere near the door, where she is not really supposed to be lingering, a young housemaid who has come in to check on the fire and cannot quite help overhearing. That, more than almost anything, is what a house like this one actually was, underneath the tapestries and the organ loft and the 7-story ceiling. People eating together, telling stories, occasionally making each other laugh, while an entire silent apparatus moved around them, invisible, essential, and never once acknowledged out loud. After the meal, the household separates the way households of this era and class generally separated after dinner. The women move to the salon, back near the winter garden, for coffee and quieter conversation. The men, George and his older guest, drift toward the library or sometimes a smaller room set aside for exactly this purpose, for cigars and the kind of conversation, business, politics, books, that was considered at the time unsuitable for mixed company, a custom that reads oddly to modern ears but was simply the water everyone in this house swam in without a second thought. George and his guest end up in the library after all, the same room George occupied alone this morning, now warmed by a second fire built specifically for the evening, and their conversation drifts, as conversations between two well-read men often will, from business into books, George pulling a volume off the shelf at one point to make a point about something, the two of them still talking a full hour after the women have already moved on from the salon to needlework and quieter subjects entirely. Somewhere in the middle of that library conversation, a piece of music drifts faintly down the hall from the salon, someone at the piano, probably Edith's guest, who mentioned earlier in the day that she plays, though not particularly well by her own modest account. It threads through the quiet house at a low volume, just present enough to notice, and it makes me think of something I want to share with you here, a small memory this house carries that predates tonight by several years. Biltmore first opened its doors to guests formally on Christmas Eve of 1895, when the house was still new enough that some rooms remained unfinished, and George Vanderbilt welcomed family for the holiday anyway, unwilling to wait any longer to actually live in the place he had spent years building. There is something I find genuinely lovely about that decision. A perfectionist by most accounts, meticulous about landscape design and library organization, and the precise placement of a tapestry, and yet when it came to actually filling the house with people he loved for the first time, he simply went ahead and did it, unfinished corners and all. The house was decorated for that first Christmas with a tree reportedly some 35 feet tall in the banquet hall, ornaments and candles, and the particular hush that a very large room takes on when it is filled with both light and shadow at once. That was several years ago now, relative to the evening we are spending together tonight, but the house still carries a version of that memory in its bones, if a house can be said to carry memory at all. Every subsequent Christmas at Biltmore has echoed that first one in some fashion, the same tree in the same hall, family gathered in a house built, in the end, not primarily to impress anyone, but to be lived in, generation after generation, which is a strange thing to say about a 250-room mansion, and yet it seems to be true. The evening continues its slow unwinding. In the salon, needlework has given way to quiet conversation, the kind that happens easily among women who have known each other long enough not to need a reason to talk. Edith's guest asks after Cornelia, and Edith, lighting up in the particular way parents do when given permission to talk about their children, describes this morning's sock-related negotiation with a fondness that makes the other women laugh. There is a softness to Edith in this room, in this hour, that the earlier, more formal parts of the day did not entirely allow room for. Hosting is work, even pleasant hosting among friends, and something in her visibly eases as the evening moves past its most demanding hours. Around 9, the household begins its slow transition toward night, though 9 is early yet by the standards of a house full of guests who have nowhere particular to be in the morning. A footman moves quietly through the public rooms checking fires, adding wood where needed, banking others down where the room will not be used again tonight. Curtains, opened at dawn by hands nobody upstairs ever saw, are drawn closed again by different hands, equally unseen, against the mountain darkness outside. Upstairs, in the guest wing, preparations for bed have already begun in rooms that will not be occupied for another hour or two yet. A housemaid turns down the bed in the room belonging to the guest who arrived early this afternoon, folding back the top sheet at a precise diagonal, plumping pillows that were already, by any reasonable standard, perfectly plump. A small fire has been laid in the room's fireplace, not yet lit, ready to be started the moment its occupant actually retires. A carafe of water sits on the nightstand, along with a single lit candle in a holder, kept there less out of necessity, since electric lighting exists throughout the house, and more out of a kind of ceremonial comfort. The sense that a bedroom ought to have a candle in it regardless of whether the candle is strictly needed. I want to talk for a moment about what it actually felt like to sleep as a guest inside a house this size, because I think it is different from what you might imagine, and different too from what it felt like to be a member of the family who had lived here long enough to know every creak and draught by heart. A guest room at Biltmore, even a relatively modest one by the house's own standards, is generous by nearly any other measure. High-ceilinged, a fireplace, heavy curtains that block the mountain dark almost completely once drawn. And yet there is something in a house this size that a smaller home simply cannot replicate, which is scale itself pressing in around you even in your solitude. You lie in bed, and you are aware, in a low background way, that you are one small occupied room among 250, most of them dark and empty tonight, stretching away from you down corridors you have not fully learnt yet. Somewhere below you, a fire is being banked. Somewhere above you, in the attic dormitories where the unmarried female staff sleep, someone is getting ready for bed in a room considerably smaller and plainer than the one you are lying in now. The house does not feel haunted exactly. It feels occupied by a kind of scale that a person's imagination has to work a little to hold on to. You might hear footsteps in the corridor outside, soft, unhurried, a footman or a housemaid finishing some last task before their own day ends, and there is something oddly comforting in that sound rather than unsettling, the knowledge that the house is not actually silent, that someone is still awake and moving through it even as you drift towards sleep, the way a child feels comforted hearing parents still talking somewhere in the house after being put to bed. The mattress is good, genuinely good, deep and properly made, and the linen has been changed for your arrival, even though the room was, by all appearances, spotless already. Somewhere down the hall, a clock chimes softly, one of dozens scattered through the house, most of them kept in close enough synchrony that the chiming, when you notice it at all, sounds almost like a single instrument rather than many separate ones. The fire settles with a small collapsing sound, embers shifting. Outside, beyond the heavy curtains, there is nothing at all. No streetlight, no passing traffic, just the particular deep dark of the North Carolina mountains at night, broken occasionally by an owl or the distant, indifferent sound of wind moving through several thousand acres of Olmsted's forest. Meanwhile, in the attic dormitories I mentioned a moment ago, a very different bedtime is unfolding, and I think it deserves its own attention rather than being treated as simply a footnote to the guest's more comfortable version of the same hour. The unmarried female staff, housemaids and kitchen maids and laundresses share rooms up under the roofline, smaller, plainer, heated less generously than the guest wings below, though not unbearably so, since even the servants' quarters at Biltmore were considered, by the standards of domestic service at the time, unusually decent. Ruth, the housemaid who spent her morning reading the Annunciator board, shares her room with another maid named Dora, and the two of them talk quietly for a few minutes before sleep, the ordinary low conversation of two people who spend most of their waking hours too busy to actually talk, catching up now on small things. A letter Dora received from her mother, whether Ruth thinks the chef is in a better mood than he was last week. There is a particular kind of intimacy in service work that does not get discussed much, the closeness that develops between people who share not just an employer, but an entire hidden world running underneath someone else's more visible life. Ruth and Dora know things about each other and about the family they serve that nobody in the guest wing below will ever be told. That knowledge is not gossip exactly, or not only gossip. It is simply what accumulates when your entire working life happens in the seams and margins of somebody else's home. Down the hall from the female servants, in a separate section of the attic, the unmarried male staff have their own quarters, smaller still in some cases, and the male and female servants' areas are kept firmly separate, a rule enforced with a seriousness that reflects the moral expectations of the era as much as any practical consideration. Edwin, George's valet, has a slightly better room than most, a small privilege that comes with his particular rank, closer in status, in certain respects, to a family member's personal companion than to household staff generally. He reads for a few minutes by lamplight before turning in, a habit he picked up, he would probably tell you if you asked, from years spent adjacent to a man who reads constantly himself. Back down in the kitchens, dinner might be finished for the family and their guests, but it is very much not finished for the people who prepared it. This is one of the parts of a story like this one that tends to get skipped over, namely that the most visible meal of the day, from the family's perspective, generates hours of invisible labour on both sides of the actual eating, hours before it arrives at the table and hours after it leaves. The scullery, tucked behind the main kitchen, is where that after work happens, and it is loud in a completely different way than the kitchens were during preparation, less the controlled bustle of cooking and more the steady clatter of china and silver and copper pans being washed, dried, and returned to their places by a team of the lowest ranked kitchen staff, scullery maids whose job is, without exaggeration, among the hardest physical work in the entire house. Hot water, harsh soap, hands raw by the end of most evenings, an enormous volume of dishes that must be cleaned not just adequately, but to a standard that will pass Emily King's or the chef's inspection the following morning. That silver, once washed here, does not simply get put away. It travels back to the butler's pantry, where the butler himself, or one of his senior footmen, goes over each piece again, checking for water spots, for the faint clouding that silver develops even after a single use, polishing anything that does not meet the standard before it is returned to its drawer, laid in specific compartments lined with a particular fabric chosen to prevent tarnish. There is a locked cabinet within the pantry, separate from the general storage where the most valuable pieces live, an ornate effigy that came from Europe, a set of serving pieces that belonged to George Vanderbilt's mother, and the butler alone holds the key to it. This is one of the quiet responsibilities that came with his rank, being trusted with the single lock in the house that even the housekeeper does not hold a key to. I mention that small detail because I think it says something about how trust functioned inside a household like this one. Rank was not just about proximity to the family or the type of work you did. It was, in a very literal sense, about which locks you were given keys to, an entire invisible architecture of trust layered on top of the visible architecture of the house itself. Let's step back outside for a moment, because I do not think I have properly described what this house actually looks like from the approach, and I think it is worth doing now, in the quiet hour after dinner, while the family and their guests are still occupied inside. George Vanderbilt designed the entrance to Biltmore deliberately to deny you an easy first look at the house. The approach road winds for nearly 3 miles through forest and along a small managed stream, curving in ways that seem almost aimless until you realize the entire route was engineered, tree by tree in some cases, to keep the house hidden from view until the last possible moment, so that when it finally appears, rising up out of the landscape all at once, the effect lands with its full intended force. This was a technique borrowed loosely from English landscape tradition, the idea that a great house should be revealed rather than simply seen, and Olmsted executed it here with an almost theatrical precision. The facade itself, when it finally does appear, is carved limestone in the style of the French Renaissance chateau that inspired it. Steeply pitched roofs, ornate dormers, turrets and spires that catch the last of the daylight at certain hours, in a way that makes the whole building seem to glow faintly from within. Gargoyles and decorative stonework worked into details most visitors never get close enough to actually examine. It took roughly 6 years and an enormous workforce, hundreds of stonemasons and labourers at the peak of construction, along with a temporary railroad spur built specifically to bring materials onto the site, to finish this facade to George Vanderbilt's satisfaction. Standing in front of it, even now, years after its completion, it does not entirely look real. It looks like something that should exist in a much older country, transplanted, somehow, into a Carolina mountainside. I find myself genuinely struck by that every time I think about it. A man born into an American fortune, built almost entirely within his own family's lifetime, chose to house that fortune inside a building designed to look as though it had stood for half a millennium. There is something almost wistful in that choice, if you let yourself read it that way. A longing, maybe, for a kind of rootedness that new money, however vast, cannot simply purchase outright. He built the appearance of it instead, stone by careful stone. Inside, the evening has settled into its final unhurried hour. George and his guest have finally emerged from the library, the fire there burning low now, and the whole party gathers once more, briefly, in the salon before everyone begins drifting toward bed. There is talk of tomorrow, a possible walk through the gardens if the weather holds. Plans loosely made the way plans get made among people who have nowhere urgent to be, and several days still ahead of them together. Edith excuses herself a little before the others, as she often does, wanting to look in on Cornelia before the child is fully asleep. She climbs the stairs, not the grand ones this time, but a smaller connecting staircase nearer the family's own rooms, and finds the nursery dim, lit only by a small night lamp the nurse keeps burning low. Cornelia is not quite asleep yet, caught in that particular drowsy in-between state small children reach right before they finally go under, and she reaches one arm up without fully opening her eyes when her mother leans over the bed. Edith sits on the edge of the small bed for a few minutes, the way she sat on the small chair this morning, in a room that, again, nobody outside the family will ever really know much about. She hums something low, not quite a full song, until her daughter's breathing evens out completely, and then she straightens, kisses her fingers and presses them lightly to the child's forehead, and slips back out into the hallway. I keep returning to these small unwitnessed moments throughout the day, and I think it is because they are, in a strange way, the actual heart of a house that otherwise announces itself so loudly through scale and stone and tapestry. Nobody built the tapestry gallery to be quiet. Nobody built the 7-story banquet hall to be intimate. But a mother humming to a nearly asleep 3-year-old in a dim nursery that happens the same way it would happen in a house a fraction of this size, and it is in the end not really different at all. Down the hall, George says his goodnights to his guests, the older gentleman heading to his own room, with a book borrowed from the library tucked under one arm, the younger guest and Edith's friend retiring not long after. Footmen and housemaids appear, almost as if summoned, though nobody rang for them specifically, simply because the household's rhythm by this hour is well enough established that everyone knows roughly when their services will be needed without being told. Candles are lit in bedrooms where guests are settling in. Fires that were laid but not yet burning earlier in the evening are finally kindled. The last trays of the day, warm milk for one guest who mentioned a preference for it, a small glass of something stronger for another, make their way quietly up the back stairs. In their own rooms, George and Edith go through their separate evening rituals, because even married, even after years together, they maintain separate bedrooms in the fashion common among wealthy couples of this era, connected by a shared door, but each fully equipped with its own fireplace, its own furniture, its own private character. Edwin helps George out of his evening clothes, hanging each piece with the same care he gave them at 4 o'clock this morning, though the sequence now runs in reverse, buttons undone rather than done, the formal architecture of the day's clothing dismantled piece by piece until George is simply a man in a dressing gown, tired in the particular satisfied way of someone who spent part of his day riding through his own forest and part of it talking books with an old friend. Next door, in Edith's room, Noemi performs a similar unwinding, unhooking the evening gown at the back, unpinning hair that took the better part of an hour to arrange this afternoon, letting it fall loose around Edith's shoulders while Edith herself sits at her dressing table, watching the day's careful construction come undone in the mirror the same way it was built, piece by piece, only now in reverse and at a much gentler pace. There is no urgency to this ritual the way there sometimes was to the morning one. Nobody is waiting downstairs for breakfast. Noemi removes the earrings chosen so carefully this morning, the ones meant to say we did not try very hard, and sets them back in their case, and something in Edith's shoulders drops half an inch the moment they are gone, a small physical relief that happens most evenings around this same hour, and that nobody but Noemi ever really witnesses. I do not think this is so very different, in its shape, from the girdle coming off at the end of a long day in a much smaller house, decades later, in a story we have told on this channel before. The clothing changes, the house changes, the scale of everything around the moment changes almost beyond recognition, but the moment itself, the quiet exhale at the end of a day spent performing a version of yourself for other people, seems to belong to nearly everyone, in nearly every era, rich or otherwise. Edith sends Noemi off for the night not long after, telling her, as she often does, not to wait up any further, though of course Noemi's actual bedtime depends on several other small tasks still waiting for her. Laying out tomorrow's undergarments, checking that tomorrow's gown has no loose threads needing attention before morning. Alone now, Edith sits for a few minutes at her dressing table in the low light of a single lamp, not doing anything in particular, simply sitting, the way a person sits at the very end of a long day, when there is finally nothing left that anyone needs from them. The candlelight, real candlelight this time, since she has kept one lit on the table beside the electric lamp out of old habit, moves faintly across the wallpaper near the window, a pale patterned silk chosen specifically for this room years ago, and the light catches the pattern's raised threads in a way that electric light alone never quite manages, softer, warmer, closer to how a room like this one would have looked lit entirely by fire and wax not so many decades earlier. There is something almost meditative in watching it. She does this most nights, this small quiet minute or two before bed, and I think it is one of the only truly unscheduled moments in her entire day, the one stretch of time nobody, not her husband, not her daughter, not a guest, not a member of the staff, has any claim on at all. Eventually she rises, blows out the candle, and gets into bed, and the house, room by room, floor by floor, begins its long transition into full night. I want to walk you through what that transition actually looks like, because it happens gradually, unevenly, different parts of the house going quiet at different hours depending on who still has work to finish. In the kitchens, the scullery maids have long since gone up to their attic rooms, but the chef himself often stays later than nearly anyone else in the house, reviewing tomorrow's menu one final time by lamplight, making small notes, occasionally stepping into the pantry to check on something before he is finally satisfied enough to head to his own quarters, which, befitting his rank, are considerably more comfortable than the shared dormitory rooms below him. In the butler's pantry, the butler makes one last round of the ground floor rooms that were used this evening, checking that fires left burning are safely banked rather than left roaring, that no lamp has been left lit unnecessarily in an empty room, that the front doors are properly secured. This is one of his most important unofficial duties, the closing down of the house each night, a responsibility that in a smaller home might belong to whoever happens to be the last one awake, but that here belongs specifically and formally to one man, because a house this size cannot simply trust that someone, generally, will remember to check. Emily King, meanwhile, is doing her own final round upstairs, quieter than the butlers, checking on guest rooms without disturbing their occupants, making sure the housemaid assigned to each corridor has finished her evening duties, that water caraves have been refilled, that everything that ought to be ready for morning already is. She keeps a small notebook with her on these rounds, not because she needs reminding of what to check. Decades of practice have made this list essentially automatic for her by now, but because writing something down at the end of a long day has a way of letting a person finally set it down mentally as well, which she has found, over the years, makes for considerably better sleep. By 11, most of the house's public rooms sit dark and empty, fires banked low, curtains drawn, the enormous scale of the place folding in on itself into something quieter and smaller feeling than it appeared even a few hours earlier. The banquet hall, so overwhelming at dinner, is now just a dark shape with a faint red glow from its banked fire, tapestries barely visible in the gloom, the organ loft silent. The Winter Garden's fountain still runs, a soft, constant, unhurried sound that nobody has ever thought to shut off overnight, and in the almost total darkness of the glassed room, that sound is really the only thing left awake. I want to take a slower turn now, since it is getting late, both in our story and probably wherever you are listening from, and spend some time simply moving through this house the way it actually felt to move through it, room by room, hour by hour, rather than following any particular task or person. Because one of the strangest things about a house this size is how differently each part of it feels, almost as though several separate buildings had been fused together under one roof. The entrance hall, where guests first step inside, is grand but somehow cool, formal, a space designed to make an impression rather than to be lingered in, stone floors that hold the day's temperature long after the air around them has shifted. Walk from there into the winter garden, and the temperature itself seems to change, warmer, more humid, that particular greenhouse smell of wet soil and growing things that no other room in the house shares. The library is warm in a different way, not simply temperature but atmosphere, wood and leather and old paper, a room that always seems a few degrees cozier than its thermometer would actually suggest, purely because of what fills it. Then there are the parts of the house that feel neither warm nor cold, so much as simply forgotten. Corridors on the upper floors that see almost no daily traffic, rooms kept ready for guests who are not currently visiting, furniture under light dust sheets in a handful of spaces. Even Emily King's staff only fully turns out a few times a year. Walking through one of these unused guest rooms in the middle of the day, sunlight falling across furniture nobody is currently using, has a peculiar stillness to it, not eerie exactly, but strangely suspended, a room waiting for a version of itself that has not happened yet. And then there is the basement, which might be the most alive part of the entire house despite being the part guests never see at all. Kitchens and laundry and storerooms and the mechanical heart of the building's heating and electrical systems, warm from the furnaces, loud in a way no other floor is loud, the constant low hum and clank of machinery that keeps 250 rooms above it, functioning without most of their occupants ever hearing a sound of it. I find that contrast worth sitting with for a moment. The most beautiful rooms in this house are, in a sense, the quietest and the least occupied, kept in a state of permanent readiness for moments that happen only occasionally, and the least beautiful room, functional, hot, crowded with pipes and boilers, is where the actual daily life of the house concentrates most densely. Beauty and life in a building like this one do not always occupy the same square footage. Let's step outside the house itself for a moment, into the wider estate, because everything the household consumed today, the milk in the morning coffee, the trout that survived the kitchen's small disagreement, the flowers Thomas cut for Emily King's guest room, the firewood keeping every fireplace in this story burning, came from somewhere, and that somewhere was an enormous, carefully managed operation in its own right. The dairy herd George Vanderbilt bread produces, on an average day, considerably more milk than the household itself could ever consume, and the surplus, along with butter and cream produced on site, was in fact sold commercially under the estate's own name, one of several ways George Vanderbilt tried, with mixed success over the years, to make an operation this vast at least partially self-sustaining, rather than a pure drain on his fortune. Wagons make the trip from the dairy barn to the house's kitchens every morning, milk still warm in some cases, and a considerably longer supply chain than most households of the era ever had to think about at all, runs quietly behind even something as simple as a cup of coffee at breakfast. Vegetables come from the gardens through most of the growing season, supplemented in colder months by what the greenhouse can produce, and by supplies brought in from Asheville when the estate's own production cannot cover it. The forest, under Gifford Pinchot's early management, and later under his successor, supplies timber, some of it used directly on the estate for construction and repair, some of it sold as part of the broader forestry operation George Vanderbilt considered nearly as important to his legacy as the house itself. Even the flowers filling vases throughout the house today, in the salon, in the guest room finished hours ahead of schedule, in the vase on Edith's own dressing table, trace back to a specific gardener's specific decision about which blooms had opened enough this particular morning to be worth cutting. None of this machinery announces itself inside the house. A guest eating trout at dinner has no reason to think about which kitchen argument nearly kept it off the menu, or which farmer down the valley the estate's own dairy competes against in the Asheville market some mornings. But it is all there, underneath everything, The same way the fires are always lit, and the beds are always made, and the silver is always polished, without anyone upstairs ever quite seeing how it happens. Let's go back for a moment to the hidden passages themselves, because I mentioned the back stairs earlier, but there is more to the house's secondary architecture than just that one parallel staircase, and I think it deserves a closer look now in this slower stretch of the night. Biltmore was built with an entire secondary circulation system woven through it, doors disguised to blend into panelling in some of the grander rooms, so that a footman could slip in to tend a fire or clear a tray without visibly entering through the same door a guest would use. Narrow service corridors run behind several of the main rooms, allowing staff to move supplies from the kitchens to the dining areas without ever crossing through the more formal parts of the house at all. There is a particular kind of skill, developed over years, in learning to move through a building like this one almost entirely through its seams, knowing which panel swings open near the banquet hall's far corner, which narrow stair drops you down closest to the pantry, which corridor lets you reach a guest room from the servant's side without ever passing a window a guest might glance out of and notice you. Ruth, the housemaid we met at the very start of tonight's story reading the Annunciator board before dawn, has walked these hidden routes so many times that she could probably do it with her eyes closed, and in a sense, some nights she nearly does, moving through darkened service corridors by memory and touch as much as by sight, a candle or later an electric torch mostly for checking her work rather than finding her way. I like thinking about the house this way, as two overlapping buildings occupying the same stone shell, one visible and formal and meant to be admired, the other hidden and functional, and meant, quite specifically, to never be noticed at all. Most guests who stayed at Biltmore over the years likely never fully realized how much of the building they simply never saw, corridors and stairs and small utility rooms that made up a genuinely significant portion of the house's total square footage, invisible not because they were secret exactly, simply because nobody ever had a reason to look for them. Let's check back in, briefly, on the guest who arrived early this afternoon, since we left her settling into a room that Emily King's staff finished hours ahead of schedule. She is asleep now, has been for a little while, in a bed she has no particular reason to suspect was not ready for her a full day in advance, in a room with fresh flowers from a greenhouse she never visited, cut by a gardener whose name she will likely never learn. If you had told her this morning, on the train from wherever she came from, about the small flurry of activity her early arrival caused, the note carried up before breakfast, the fires laid ahead of schedule, the flowers repositioned twice on the mantel until Emily King was satisfied, she would probably have been genuinely embarrassed by the trouble. That embarrassment is, in its own way, exactly what the entire system was built to prevent her from ever having to feel. The trouble happened, she was simply never allowed to see it. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. So much of what we now think of as luxury, real luxury, the kind money alone cannot quite purchase without also purchasing the invisible labour of dozens of other people, comes down to exactly this, the careful, deliberate removal of visible effort from someone else's experience. It is a strange kind of gift, when you think about it closely, given by people who mostly never get thanked for giving it, because thanking them would require noticing them in the first place, and noticing them was never really part of the arrangement. There is a particular kind of housemaid's work I have not spent much time on yet tonight, and it deserves its own attention, because it is perhaps the most physically demanding of all the domestic roles in this house, more demanding in some ways than the kitchen work, simply because of how much of it involves carrying things up and down 4 flights of stairs, over and over all day long. A chambermaid's morning, before any guest wakes, involves carrying water, buckets of it, up to rooms that do have private bathrooms attached, but that still in this era rely on staff to keep basins filled and fresh even where plumbing exists, along with coal for fires, armfuls of linen, and later in the day the reverse trip, carrying down whatever needs to be removed, ash from grates, yesterday's linen bound for the laundry, anything left behind that a guest might not think to mention wanting removed. Ruth and the other chambermaids on her corridor make this same set of trips dozens of times over a single day, and by evening most of them could tell you exactly how many stairs sit between the servants' stair on their particular floor and each individual guest room, not as a fact they consciously memorized, but as a kind of physical knowledge that simply accumulates in the legs and lower back after enough repetition. Making a bed properly, the way Emily King required it to be made, was its own small skill as well, not simply pulling sheets straight, but a specific sequence, bottom sheet tucked with hospital corners before that term existed to describe them, top sheet folded back at an exact measured width, pillows arranged just so, an entire small choreography that a new housemaid might take weeks to fully master to Emily King's satisfaction, and that Ruth herself, watching newer girls train, sometimes forgets she ever had to learn at all, her hands simply knowing it now, the way a pianist's hands know a scale. I want to mention the china for a moment too, because I have talked about silver a fair amount tonight, and the china deserves equal attention. The Vanderbilts owned several different sets, chosen for different occasions and different levels of formality, hand-painted patterns imported from Europe, some pieces trimmed in gold that had to be washed by hand rather than risked in the harsher cleaning methods used on more everyday dishware. A single chip or crack in a piece from the good set was treated almost as a small crisis, not because a replacement could not eventually be sourced, but because matching an imported pattern exactly, on short notice, from rural North Carolina in 1900 was genuinely difficult, and a chipped plate discovered right before a formal dinner could send a footman scrambling to find an acceptable substitute from the household's slightly less formal backup set, hoping nobody at the table would notice the substitution at all. The clocks scattered through the house, dozens of them, French mostly. Ornate cases in gilt and porcelain were another small daily responsibility belonging to a specific footman whose job included winding each one on a regular schedule and adjusting them against a master timepiece kept in the servants' hall, so that the soft chiming I mentioned earlier, drifting through the guest's bedroom as she fell asleep, stayed close enough to synchronize that nobody upstairs ever noticed the small daily labor required to keep dozens of separate mechanical hearts beating in time with one another throughout an entire house. Paintings and sculpture fill nearly every major room, some inherited, much of it purchased specifically for this house during George Vanderbilt's extensive travels and collecting, portraits and landscapes and classical subjects chosen with the same careful, well-read taste he brought to his library. A small sculpture in the winter garden, the bronze figures rising from the fountain we mentioned earlier, required occasional cleaning of its own, a task handled not by household staff, but by a specialist brought in periodically from outside, since fine bronze work called for expertise none of the regular staff possessed. All of this, silver and china and clocks and bronze, existed in a kind of constant quiet maintenance, an entire ecosystem of care wrapped around objects that guests generally noticed only in passing, if they noticed them consciously at all, on their way to noticing something else, a view out a window, a conversation at dinner, the particular way afternoon light fell across the tapestry gallery. The objects themselves were, in a sense, working just as hard as the people who maintained them, working to create an impression of effortless, ancient grandeur in a house that had in fact existed for only a handful of years. I mentioned the bathrooms earlier tonight in passing, that startling number, something in the range of 43 of them scattered through the house at a time when most American homes still made do with a single shared facility if they had indoor plumbing at all. I want to return to that for a moment, because a number like 43 tends to slide right past you unless you actually picture what it meant, day to day, for the people living inside this house. It meant that George Vanderbilt did not share a bathroom with his wife. Each of their suites equipped with its own tiled and fitted with fixtures imported at considerable expense, hot water arriving through pipes fed by boilers down in the basement that ran essentially around the clock to keep pace with the demands of a house this size. It meant that guests arriving from homes where a hot bath might require servants hauling kettles up several flights of stairs could simply turn a tap and within a reasonable stretch of time have as much hot water as they wanted, a genuine marvel to most visitors even though the house was built specifically so that marvel would feel unremarkable, simply the way things worked here. Keeping that system running was its own quiet specialty, an engineer employed specifically to monitor the boilers and the electrical generating equipment housed in the basement, a role that did not exist in most private homes of the era at all, because most private homes of the era did not require anything resembling what Biltmore required. He is at this hour of the night likely already asleep in his own quarters, though the boilers themselves are tended in shifts, someone checking on them periodically through the small hours to make sure the fires beneath them do not need attention, ensuring that when George Vanderbilt turns his own tap tomorrow morning, hot water simply arrives, the way it always does, the way it is meant to. The elevators, too, keep a kind of quiet second life after the family and guests have gone to bed, used now mostly by staff carrying the day's last errands between floors, a footman riding the smaller service elevator down with an armful of items from an upstairs room that needed clearing, rather than making the trip on foot down the narrow back stairs the way an earlier generation of servants in an earlier generation of grand houses would have had no choice but to do. George Vanderbilt's fascination with mechanical efficiency touched even this small, unglamorous corner of daily household life, and I think that if you had asked him directly what mattered most to him about the house he built, somewhere in his answer, alongside the library and the landscape and the tapestries, he would have mentioned this too, quietly, almost as an afterthought, the simple relief of not asking another human being to carry heavy things up flights of stairs unnecessarily when a machine could do it instead. Let's slow down even further now, because it really is very late, both in the story and, I suspect, for a good number of you listening. The house has settled almost entirely into stillness. Outside, beyond those heavy curtains in every occupied bedroom, the mountain darkness is complete, no moon visible tonight through what turned out to be a thin scattering of high cloud, just the vague darker shapes of the surrounding hills against a slightly less dark sky, and somewhere out past the formal gardens, an owl calls once, twice, and then goes quiet, swallowed back into the general hush of several thousand acres of Olmsted's carefully managed forest, holding its breath along with everything else. Inside, a single lamp still burns in the servants' hall, where a young footman named Walter, the most junior member of the household staff, old enough to be trusted with a full night's watch, sits at a small table with a cup of tea gone lukewarm an hour ago, keeping half an eye on the annunciator board in case anyone upstairs should happen to need something in these smallest hours of the night. It rarely rings this late. Most nights, Walter's watch passes in near total quiet, broken only by the house's own small sounds, a settling timber somewhere, the winter garden's fountain still running faintly down the hall, the low hum of machinery from the basement below. He has a book open in front of him, borrowed, with permission, from a lower shelf in the library that George Vanderbilt long ago decided the staff were welcome to use, so long as everything was returned in good condition, and Walter reads a few pages at a time, between glances at the board, in a kind of quiet privilege that would have surprised most outsiders, the idea that even here, at the very bottom of the household's formal hierarchy, some small measure of the house's vast, restless intellectual appetite had trickled all the way down. I want to return one more time tonight to Cornelia, because there is something about her particular situation that I find myself thinking about more than almost anything else in this story, and it seems worth sharing with you now, in this quiet stretch before we close things out entirely. She is growing up as the only child in a house with 250 rooms, which sounds, on its surface, like it should be a kind of paradise, endless space, endless attention from a household staff of more than 30 people, a rocking horse she has already declared too small for her at 3 years old, toys shipped from Paris, and in many ways it is a remarkable childhood, by almost any measure available to a child born in this particular era, but it is also, quietly, a solitary one. There are no siblings running through these corridors with her. The nearest children her own age live some distance from the estate, daughters of the estate's farm managers or of families in the nearest town, and while Edith makes real efforts, as she will continue to make over the coming years, to give her daughter some ordinary companionship, playdates and visits arranged with the same careful attention Edith brings to everything else, Cornelia's daily world is, for now, largely populated by adults, her nurse, her parents in their brief, warm, scheduled visits, the household staff who know her by name and indulge her in small ways that would probably horrify Emily King if she witnessed all of them. I do not say this to suggest her childhood was sad exactly. I do not think it was. not from what the historical record suggests about a woman who would grow into someone spirited and independent-minded, someone who would eventually chafe against a great deal of what this formal, beautiful world expected of her. But there is a particular kind of loneliness available only to the extraordinarily fortunate, a loneliness made of space rather than lack, of a house too large for the number of people actually living inside it. And I think Cornelia, even at 3, in her own limited way, already understands something of that, without having any words yet for what it is she understands. It is autumn, this particular week in our story. The mountains around Biltmore, somewhere in that slow turn from green into colour that western North Carolina does so well, and the fires that have been burning in nearly every room we have visited tonight carry a slightly different character than they would in high summer, more necessary than decorative, the house's enormous stone walls holding on to a chill that the season has only just begun to bring. Tomorrow, if the weather holds the way George predicted at breakfast, there may be that walk through the gardens Edith and her guest discussed, the last real stretch of mild weather before the mountains properly turn toward winter, and somewhere in the back of Emily King's endlessly organized mind, a note is already forming about which guest rooms will need heavier blankets added within the next few weeks, whether the coming holiday season, still some months off, but never quite far enough off to stop thinking about entirely, in a house that has to plan its own Christmas trees months in advance, will bring the usual gathering of family the way it has every year since that first one back in 1895. We are close to the end of our night together now, both mine inside this story and, I hope, yours out there in the actual dark of wherever you are. Let's finish walking through the house one last time. Let's start at the front, at the entrance hall, where a single lamp has been left burning low, enough to make out the shape of the stone floor and the dark wood panelling, but not much more than that. This is the room where every guest's first impression of Biltmore is formed, and at night, emptied of the people it was built to impress, it takes on an almost different personality entirely, quieter, plainer somehow, a stage with the actors gone home. Through the double doors, the winter garden holds its fountain sound, steady, patient, the only room in the house that never fully goes silent even at 3 in the morning, palm fronds barely visible as darker shapes against the glass ceiling above, which tonight shows nothing but that thin scattering of cloud we mentioned. No stars, no moon, just a faint variation in the darkness that tells you the sky is technically still up there somewhere. Past the winter garden, the tapestry gallery stretches long and narrow and fully dark now, the 3 Flemish scenes on its walls invisible in this light, though if you knew exactly where to look, you could probably still trace their outlines from memory. Vulcan at his forge, colours softened by 4 centuries into something closer to memory itself than to actual pigment. The banquet hall sits at the end of that gallery, 7 stories of vaulted dark overhead, utterly silent now. The long table cleared hours ago and reset already, in fact, for tomorrow's breakfast. A small quiet act of preparation that happened while everyone upstairs was still finishing dinner, footmen resetting one meal's table almost before the previous meal's dishes had even made it back to the scullery. That detail has always struck me as a particularly honest illustration of how this whole system worked. The house is never actually caught up. It is always, in some small way, already working on tomorrow before today has finished happening. Past the gallery, the library still holds a faint warmth from its 2 fires, banked now to embers, and the particular smell of the room, old paper and leather and wood smoke, lingers even with nobody inside it, the way a room sometimes holds the shape of recent occupation for a while after the people themselves have gone. George's chair by the fireplace sits at the same angle it always sits at, worn slightly at the arms, waiting for tomorrow morning when he will settle into it again, in his riding clothes or otherwise, with whatever book currently holds his attention. Up the grand staircase now, past the chandelier hanging silent and dark in the stairwell's centre, its hundreds of pieces of glass catching almost nothing in this dim light, just faint suggestions of shape where the low hall lamps below still reach. On the second floor, the guest corridor is quiet, doors closed, a thin line of firelight visible under 1 or 2 of them, where a fire has not yet fully died down for the night. Somewhere behind one of these doors, the the guest who arrived early this afternoon sleeps on in a room she will remember whenever she thinks back on this visit in years to come as simply comfortable, simply ready, with no memory at all of the particular flurry of quiet effort that made it feel that way. Further along, past the family's private rooms, the nursery holds its own small pocket of warmth and quiet. Cornelia fully asleep now, her nurse dozing in a chair nearby, with the particular light sleep of someone whose job includes being ready to wake instantly if needed. A single night lamp burns low in the corner, casting just enough light to make out the shape of the rocking horse in the corner, currently unused, currently too small, currently loved anyway. And in their own separate rooms, connected by that shared door neither of them has bothered to close tonight, George and Edith Vanderbilt sleep in a house built, in the end, not primarily to be looked at, though it is looked at endlessly by every guest who ever passes through it, but to hold exactly this, two people and their small daughter, safe and warm and largely unaware, most nights, of just how much invisible effort surrounds their ordinary rest. Before we let the house rest completely, I want to spend some time on the story of how a place like this even came to exist at all, because I think it deepens everything else we have talked about tonight, and because it is in its own way as remarkable as anything happening inside the walls right now. George Vanderbilt was a grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the shipping and railroad magnate whose fortune, built across just a few decades of the 1800s, became one of the largest private fortunes the country had ever seen. George himself was something of an outlier within his own family, less interested in business and finance than his brothers and cousins, drawn instead to books, to travel, to architecture and landscape, a temperament that made him, in the eyes of some relatives, the quiet, bookish one, and in the eyes of history, the one who built something that has genuinely outlasted almost everything else his more commercially minded relatives constructed. As a young man, he travelled extensively through Europe with his mother, to whom he was especially close, and those early trips, museum visits and cathedral tours and long afternoons in bookshops across several countries shaped his taste and his curiosity in ways that would echo, decades later, through nearly every room of the house we have spent tonight exploring. Friends from that period of his life describe a young man who preferred a quiet afternoon with a book to almost any of the more fashionable diversions available to someone of his considerable means, a temperament that never really left him, even once fortune and family expectation eventually handed him an estate the size of a small kingdom to manage. He first visited the mountains around Asheville in the mid-1880s, drawn by the climate, which was already becoming known in this era as beneficial for various health conditions, and by the sheer scenic beauty of the Blue Ridge landscape, and something about the place took hold of him in a way that surprised even people who knew him well. He began quietly buying land, parcel by parcel, farm by farm, eventually assembling an estate that at its largest stretched across something in the neighbourhood of 125,000 acres, an almost unimaginable scale for a single private landholding, though the working core of the estate immediately around the house itself was considerably smaller than that vast total. Construction on the house began in the late 1880s, and it took roughly 6 years to complete, employing at its peak well over 1,000 workers, stonemasons, carpenters, woodcarvers, plasterers, many of them local to the region, learning specialised trades on the job that would go on to shape the local economy of Asheville for years afterward. A temporary railroad spur, several miles long, was built specifically to haul stone and lumber and imported materials directly onto the construction site, since no existing rail line came anywhere close enough to make the job feasible otherwise. There is something almost staggering about that fact when you actually sit with it, an entire temporary railroad, built and later removed, existing for the sole purpose of getting one house finished. Richard Morris Hunt, the architect, had already established himself as one of the most sought-after designers of grand residences for wealthy American families, and he and George Vanderbilt worked closely together over the years of planning and construction, Hunt bringing his deep knowledge of French Renaissance architecture, Vanderbilt bringing an almost obsessive attention to detail about how the house would actually be lived in, not just how it would look in photographs. Frederick Law Olmsted, meanwhile, already elderly by the time this project began, considered the landscape work at Biltmore among the most significant of his long career, a chance in his own later years to design not simply a park within a city, but an entire managed rural landscape from nothing, gardens near the house giving way to increasingly naturalistic plantings, and beyond that, the beginnings of the scientific forestry program that would eventually make George Vanderbilt something of an unlikely pioneer in American conservation. I find something genuinely moving in this, that this house, built at a scale that can only really be described as excessive, was also at the very same time home to one of the earliest serious efforts in this country to manage a forest sustainably rather than simply strip it for profit. Gifford Pinchot's work here, and later that of his successor Carl Schenck, who founded the first forestry school in America, right here on the estate, grew directly out of George Vanderbilt's own genuine curiosity about how land could be used responsibly across generations rather than exhausted within one. The same man who built a 250-room French chateau in the Appalachian Mountains also helped invent modern American forestry, and I do not think those two facts sit as awkwardly beside each other as they might initially seem to. Both, in their own way, were expressions of the same underlying temperament, a man who thought in terms of decades and centuries rather than seasons, who wanted to build something that would still be standing, in one form or another, long after he himself was gone. The estate's economic relationship with the surrounding region deserves a mention too, because a project of this scale did not exist in isolation. Asheville itself grew considerably during and after Biltmore's construction, drawing workers, tradespeople, and eventually a steady stream of curious visitors once portions of the estate began opening to the public decades later, long after the period we are visiting tonight. Edith Vanderbilt, in the years following George's own death, which lies still some distance ahead of the particular night we are spending inside this house, would go on to become deeply involved in the region's economic and civic life herself, founding local industries, supporting schools, playing a role in Asheville's development that extended well beyond the walls of the house she once managed as a young hostess. None of that has happened yet on this particular autumn night we have been spending together. Tonight, she is simply a woman in her 30s, tired after a long day of hosting, sitting for a quiet minute at her dressing table before bed, with no way of knowing yet just how much of her life still lies ahead of her, inside and eventually beyond these walls. I have not said much yet about the stables, and I think they deserve a few minutes, because George Vanderbilt's relationship with his horses tells you something about him that the library and the forestry work only partly capture on their own. The stable complex sits a short distance from the main house, built with the same careful attention to both function and appearance that characterizes nearly everything else on this estate. Stalls kept immaculately clean, a covered riding ring for use in poor weather, quarters above the stables themselves for the grooms and stable hands who work here, a slightly separate world from the household staff proper, their days governed less by bells and annunciator boards, and more by the needs of the animals themselves, feeding schedules, exercise, the particular attentiveness that horses require, regardless of what the rest of the household happens to be doing at any given hour. George rode nearly every day the weather allowed it, as we saw this afternoon, and by most accounts genuinely loved horses, rather than simply keeping them as a mark of status the way many wealthy men of his era did. He knew his horses individually, their temperaments, their particular quirks, in a way that suggests real affection rather than mere ownership. The head groom, a man who has worked with horses his entire adult life and who reports, in matters concerning the stables, more or less directly to George himself rather than through the usual household hierarchy, takes a quiet pride in keeping the stock in excellent condition, and there is a particular satisfaction, he would probably tell you if asked, in serving a master who actually notices and cares about the difference between adequate care and genuinely excellent care. Edith rides too, though less frequently than her husband, and Cornelia will grow into an accomplished horsewoman herself in the years ahead, though tonight she is still small enough that her own riding lessons, on a very gentle, very patient pony kept specifically for the purpose, are still a year or two away. I want to say something now about the working conditions of the staff more broadly, because it would be easy, telling a story warmed by candlelight and soft piano music and quiet domestic tenderness, to lose sight of something important, that this was, for the people actually doing the work, genuinely hard labour, performed on a schedule that most of us today would find close to unbearable. A housemaid's day at Biltmore typically ran something close to 14 hours, beginning well before dawn and not truly ending until the household's public rooms were fully closed down for the night, 6 days a week, with perhaps a half day off on a rotating basis and, depending on the position, some portion of a Sunday for those whose duties allowed it. And yet, by the standards actually available to working-class women and men in this era and region, a position in the household of a family like the Vanderbilts was, in many respects, a genuinely good job. Room and board were provided, freeing wages almost entirely for savings or for support sent home to family, in a period when many alternative forms of employment, farm labour, textile millwork, offered considerably harder conditions for considerably less security. Biltmore's staff quarters, while modest compared to the family's own rooms, were by domestic service standards of the era unusually well built and well heated. Meals prepared for staff, while simpler than what appeared upstairs, were plentiful, in a household wealthy enough that skimping on its own employees' food would have seemed almost beneath its dignity. I do not offer this context to suggest the arrangement was equal, or that the deep imbalance of power running through every relationship in this house should be minimized. It should not be, but I think the fuller, more honest picture includes both things at once: real hardship and, relative to the available alternatives of the time, real opportunity. And I find that a more interesting and more truthful way to sit with this story than either romanticizing the servants' lives or flattening them into pure victimhood. Ruth and Sarah and Dora and Edwin and Noemi and Walter were not simply background figures in someone else's story. They were people making the best available choices within a world that offered them, as it offered nearly everyone of their class and era, a fairly narrow set of options to choose from. Sundays looked a little different from the rhythm we have spent tonight following, and it is worth a brief mention before we move toward closing things out. The family attended services at All Souls Church, built by George Vanderbilt himself as part of the model village he constructed near the estate for many of his employees and their families, a small Episcopal church designed with the same architectural seriousness he brought to everything else, though at a far more human, intimate scale than the house itself. A good portion of the household staff attended services there too, on a rotating schedule that allowed the house to keep functioning even on a day nominally set aside for rest, someone always remaining behind to tend fires and prepare whatever simplified meals a Sunday called for. This model village, called Biltmore Village, sat just outside the estate's main gates, and it was very much George Vanderbilt's own social project, as much as a practical necessity. Houses for estate workers and their families, built to a standard considerably higher than typical worker housing of the era, along with a school, shops, and the church itself, an entire small community that owed its existence to one family's fortune and one man's particular, rather paternalistic vision of what responsible wealth ought to look like. It is a complicated legacy in some ways, this kind of benevolent oversight extending into nearly every corner of employees' lives, admirable in its material generosity, and at the same time a reminder of just how completely the Vanderbilts' influence extended over the daily existence of everyone connected to the estate, at church as much as in the kitchen. Let's return one final time to Edith, because I have described her as hostess and mother and wife tonight. But there is one more role worth mentioning before we let her rest completely, which is the sheer volume of correspondence a woman in her position was expected to manage. Letters arrive at Biltmore daily, dozens of them some days, invitations to be accepted or declined, thank you notes to be written following even the smallest social visit, correspondence with family scattered across New York and Newport and further afield, and Edith handles the bulk of this herself, at a small writing desk in her own sitting room, in a neat, practiced hand, usually for an hour or more each afternoon, that we did not have time to properly visit tonight, amid everything else happening in the house. This correspondence was not simply social obligation. It was, in its own quiet way, infrastructure, the social equivalent of the Annunciator board and the back stairs, an entire invisible system of obligation and courtesy that kept the Vanderbilts connected to a wider network of family and society, whose good opinion mattered enormously to how smoothly life at this level actually functioned. A missed thank you note, a late reply to an invitation, these were not small things in this world. They were, in their own way, as important to maintaining the household standing as a properly polished piece of silver or a perfectly made bed. The afternoon we spent partly in the winter garden also included, though I did not dwell on it earlier, a little time at the piano for Edith's guest, and some quiet card games later in the evening that I mentioned only in passing, whist mostly, played by the fire in the salon after the men rejoined the women, a gentle, unhurried kind of entertainment that filled the hours between dinner and bed in nearly every wealthy household of this era, requiring just enough attention to keep conversation flowing without ever feeling like genuine competition. All of this correspondence and cards and piano and quiet Sunday mornings at a church built by the man whose house we have spent tonight exploring adds up to something larger than any single detail on its own, a complete world, self-contained, elaborate, running on rules and rhythms that would seem almost impossibly formal to most of us now, and yet inhabited, underneath all that formality, by people who loved their children and worried about their guests' comfort and occasionally made dry jokes at the dinner table that made a housemaid near the door laugh despite herself. I keep thinking about Sarah, the kitchen maid we met right at the very beginning of tonight's story, on her knees in front of a cold iron range at 4 a.m, and I want to give her a proper ending before we finish, because it seems only fair, given how much of this night we owe to that first small fire she built nearly 24 hours ago now. She is 19 this year, come to Biltmore from a farming family a few counties over, drawn here the way many young women in this region were drawn, by wages that, however modest by our standards, represented genuine independence, money of her own that did not have to be handed straight to a father or an older brother the way it might have if she had stayed on the family farm. She sends a portion of what she earns home each month anyway, by choice rather than obligation, and keeps a small amount back for herself, saved carefully in a tin box under her bed in the attic dormitory she shares with 2 other kitchen maids, towards some future she has not fully decided on yet, though she thinks sometimes about eventually training as a cook in her own right, working her way up the kitchen hierarchy, the way the chef himself once did, decades ago, in a kitchen considerably smaller and less grand than this one. Sarah finished her own long day hours ago, somewhere around 9, after the dinner service wound down and the last of the pots was scrubbed and hung, and she is asleep now, has been for some time, in a room considerably plainer than any we visited tonight, but warm enough, and her own in the sense that matters most to a 19-year-old away from home for the first time, a small space that nobody else has any claim on once the door is closed. Tomorrow she will be back in front of that same iron range before dawn, working ash out of a fire that went cold again overnight, and the entire cycle we have followed tonight will begin again, nearly identical in its broad shape and endlessly different in its small particulars, a different note perhaps arriving from Asheville, a different small crisis quietly solved before anyone upstairs even knows one occurred, a different combination of small kindnesses and small frustrations filling the 14 hours between her waking and her sleeping. That, more than anything else, might be the real shape of a house like Biltmore. Not a single remarkable day though today, with its early guest and its small flurry of extra preparation, was slightly more eventful than most, but an endless patient repetition, fires lit and fires banked, silver polished and silver used and silver polished again, beds made and slept in and made again, day after day after day, for years, for the family's entire remaining lifetime in this house and beyond it, long after tonight's particular guests have gone home and been replaced by other guests, long after Sarah herself has perhaps moved on to some other position or some other life entirely. Seasons will turn around this house the way they turn around any house, though here the turning carries its own particular rituals. Spring brings the gardens fully back to life, the walled garden especially, tended year-round but truly spectacular only for a handful of months, and with it a corresponding uptick in outdoor entertaining, garden parties and long afternoon walks along paths Olmsted laid out specifically to reveal the landscape gradually, one composed view opening after another as you move through them. Summer brings the mountain heat, milder here than in the lowlands, but still enough to change the household's rhythm somewhat. Heavier curtains in some rooms giving way to lighter ones. The winter garden, ironically, becoming one of the cooler rather than warmer rooms in the house during the hottest weeks. Autumn, the season we have spent tonight inside, brings this particular golden turning of the mountains and a corresponding shift back toward the fires and the close, warm, book-lined comfort of rooms like the library. And winter brings Christmas, the 35-foot tree in the banquet hall, the tradition begun that first year in 1895 and repeated, with only small variations, every year since. I want to spend a little time now on what a longer stay at Biltmore looked like, because the two guests currently sleeping upstairs tonight are only staying a handful of days, but the house was built, in large part, around the idea of the extended visit, weeks rather than days, house parties that might bring a dozen or more guests at once for an entire season of activity. During these larger gatherings, the household's daily rhythm we have followed tonight simply multiplies. More rooms to prepare, more meals to coordinate, more laundry, more correspondence, more of everything, and Emily King and the butler between them essentially run a small, temporary hotel operation layered on top of the family's ordinary domestic life. Activities expand too, hunting parties in the surrounding forest during the appropriate season, more elaborate entertaining, sometimes musicians brought in from Asheville or further afield for an evening's dancing in one of the larger rooms cleared specifically for the purpose. Guests during these longer visits came from across the wealthy social circles George and Edith moved within. New York primarily, though Newport and occasionally guests from abroad made the considerable journey down to the mountains as well, drawn by curiosity about this famous house as much as by friendship with its owners. For the household staff, these larger gatherings represented both the hardest stretches of work in their entire year and, in a strange way, some of the more interesting ones. A break from routine, new faces to observe, occasionally a bit of extra money in the form of gratuities that guests, by the informal customs of the era, were expected to leave for staff who had served them particularly well during an extended stay. Ruth has, over her time here, developed something close to a specialty in reading which guests are the generous sort, and which are not, purely from small cues, how they speak to staff, whether they remember a name after being told it once, whether they seem to notice the room at all, or simply pass through it as though the bed made itself, and the fire lit itself, and none of it required a single other human being's attention. Tonight's two guests, from what little we have seen of them, seem to fall on the more considerate end of that particular scale, and Ruth, along with the temporary lady's maid assigned to assist Edith's friend for the duration of her stay, will likely find their week here somewhat more pleasant for it. One of the small unpredictable variables that made each new set of guests, in its own quiet way, a fresh little unknown for the staff managing them. It occurs to me, thinking about all of this, that a house like Biltmore functioned almost like a small self-contained society, complete in itself, with its own economy, its own hierarchy, its own social customs, its own rhythms of work and rest, existing inside a single vast building, the way a whole town might exist inside a set of walls. 250 rooms sounds, at first, like simple excess, and in some sense, of course, it was exactly that. But it also sounds, the longer you sit inside the story of a single day and night, like the one we have spent here together, like something closer to an entire small civilization, complete with its own dawn and its own dusk, its own rulers and its own quiet, essential, largely unrecognized working class, its own festivals and its own ordinary Tuesdays, functioning, mostly smoothly, mostly without visible strain, behind a facade carved to look 400 years old and lit, every single night, by a system of electric bulbs that would have seemed like something close to magic to nearly anyone standing outside its walls. Something happens actually around 1 in the morning, small enough that it barely qualifies as an event at all, but worth mentioning because it brings us back, one last time, to that annunciator board where we began this whole story before dawn yesterday. A flag drops. Walter, dozing slightly over his book in the servants' hall, sits up immediately, old habit overriding drowsiness in an instant, and checks the number against his memorized list of rooms. It is the older gentleman's room, the one who spent the evening in the library talking books with George. Walter climbs the back stairs quickly but without hurry, the particular pace developed by staff who have learnt that urgency and haste are not actually the same thing, and knock softly at the door. It turns out to be nothing serious at all. The guest, unable to sleep, wanted only a glass of water, and perhaps, if it were not too much trouble at this hour, a little more wood for a fire that has burned down further than he expected. Walter fetches both without complaint, without any visible sign that being roused from his book at 1 in the morning is anything other than exactly what he is here for, and within a few minutes the fire is built back up, the water is on the nightstand, and the guest, embarrassed in the mild way people often are about needing something so small in the middle of the night, thanks him twice and settles back into bed. Walter returns to the servants' hall, notes the small errand in Emily King's logbook the way he has been trained to, and picks his book back up. And I think there is something worth noticing in just how ordinary this whole exchange was, how neither party treated it as remarkable in any way. A guest needing a small thing at an odd hour, and a system built quietly, patiently, specifically to make sure that need never went more than a few minutes unanswered, day or night, for as long as the house has stood, and in truth, for as long as this way of living persisted in America at all. This is, I think, the last small errand of the night. The board goes still again after Walter's return, all its flags flush, and it will likely stay that way now until the household properly wakes in a few hours' time. I want to spend a final few minutes with George Vanderbilt himself before we close this story out completely, because I do not think I have quite captured him yet, not fully, across everything we have covered tonight. He is, by the account of nearly everyone who knew him, a genuinely gentle man, more comfortable with a book than with the kind of aggressive business dealing that made his family's fortune in the first place. Generous in ways that sometimes worried his more financially minded relatives, who occasionally wondered aloud whether Biltmore itself, magnificent as it was, represented sound judgment or simply an extraordinarily beautiful extravagance that would eventually outstrip even a Vanderbilt fortune's ability to sustain it. There is truth on both sides of that old family worry, if I am honest with you. The estate was, across George Vanderbilt's lifetime, a genuinely difficult financial undertaking, ambitious well past the point of easy sustainability, and in the years following tonight's particular visit, he will in fact sell off a considerable portion of the original vast acreage, some of it eventually becoming the core of what is now Pisgah National Forest, a decision that turned out, in hindsight, to be one of the more significant contributions to American conservation to come out of this entire story, even though at the time it likely felt, to George himself, more like a financial necessity than a grand environmental legacy in the making. But sitting in his library tonight, fire warm at his feet, an old friend beside him, a full house of family and guests sleeping soundly above and around him, none of that future difficulty seems to weigh on him particularly heavily. He built the thing he wanted to build. He is, on this particular autumn night, simply a man who loves books and trees and his wife and his small daughter, living inside a dream he spent the better part of a decade constructing. One room, one tapestry, one carefully placed tree at a time. I have mentioned Noemi a number of times tonight without saying much about who she actually is, and I want to correct that now, because her own story is one of the more interesting threads running quietly underneath everything we have followed so far. She came to America nearly a decade ago now, from a small town outside Lyon, having trained first as a seamstress before working her way into ladies' maid positions with increasingly prominent families, first in Paris briefly, then in New York, where her particular combination of skills, expert needlework, a genuine eye for fashion, fluent English learned carefully and deliberately over several years, made her considerably more valuable and considerably more highly paid than most domestic staff in America at the time. Edith hired her away from a New York family with what was, by the standards of domestic service, an unusually generous offer, recognizing early on that a truly skilled lady's maid was not simply someone who could dress hair competently, but someone who understood taste itself, who could be trusted to make small independent judgments about fashion and presentation that reflected well on her employer, even in moments Edith herself was not available to oversee directly. There is a particular kind of intimacy in the lady's maid relationship that goes beyond even what I described earlier tonight regarding proximity and trust. Noemi has, over years of service, become something closer to a confidant than a mere employee, privy not just to Edith's physical self in its most unguarded moments, but increasingly to her thoughts as well, the small worries about a difficult letter, the private opinion about a guest that could never be spoken aloud downstairs, the particular anxieties that come with running a household this size and this visible. Edith trusts her, genuinely, in a way that crosses whatever formal boundary of class technically separates them, and Noemi, for her part, guards that trust carefully, aware that it represents both a genuine bond and the entire foundation of her own considerable professional value. Edwin, George's valet, has a somewhat different story. English-born, trained in service from a young age the way many English men of his class and background were, working his way up through several increasingly prestigious households in England itself before George Vanderbilt, on one of his own trips abroad, hired him away with an offer attractive enough to justify the considerable disruption of relocating permanently to America. Edwin brought with him not just skill, but an entire inherited tradition of English valeting, a set of standards and practices passed down through generations of service that gave Biltmore's household, in certain small particulars, a slightly English character layered on top of its French architectural inspiration and its distinctly American ambition and scale. The two of them, Noemi and Edwin, occupy a strange middle position within the household's formal hierarchy, outranking most other staff in terms of trust and intimacy, while remaining, technically, still servants, still subject to the same fundamental power imbalance that governs every relationship in this house between employer and employed. They dine separately from the rest of the staff, in fact, at a small table set apart within the servants' hall, an arrangement that reflects both a genuine privilege and a genuine isolation, closer to the family than anyone else in the building, and, in a certain sense, more alone for it, belonging fully to neither world. I think about that particular loneliness sometimes, the strange position of people trusted enormously and yet never quite equal, valued and yet never quite belonging, and I do not think either Noemi or Edwin would necessarily describe their own lives in such melancholy terms if you ask them directly. They are, by most measures available to them, successful in their chosen professions, well paid, well regarded, secure in a way many domestic workers of the era were not, but there is something in that particular in-between space, close enough to intimacy to feel its warmth, and never quite close enough to claim equal standing within it, that I find myself thinking about long after the rest of tonight's story has faded. The outside world reaches Biltmore mostly through the newspapers that arrive daily, brought up from Asheville along with the Morning Post, and George reads them carefully most mornings, along with whatever business correspondence requires his attention, a reminder that even in this deliberately secluded mountain retreat, the family remains connected to the wider currents of American life, financial news from New York, political developments, the ordinary churn of a country still finding its shape as it moves toward a new century. Edith reads her own share of newspapers too, along with a fair number of magazines devoted to fashion and to the kind of social and charitable causes that will increasingly occupy more of her attention as the years pass. There is a particular kind of insulation that a house like Biltmore provides. 3 miles of winding approach road between the family and the nearest town, thousands of acres of managed forest surrounding them on every side, and yet the insulation was never complete, nor was it meant to be. George Vanderbilt did not build this house to escape the world so much as to create a particular vantage point from which to engage with it, on his own terms, at his own pace, surrounded by the books and the landscape and the quiet that let him think clearly about whatever mattered to him that day, whether that was a difficult passage in a novel or a decision about how many acres of forest to sell. Music, too, threads through the house in ways I have only briefly touched on tonight. The organ in the banquet hall, the same one that occasionally accompanies dinner, sees more serious use during larger gatherings, when a hired organist might play for an hour or more, while guests linger over coffee, the sound filling that 7-story space in a way that makes the whole room feel, for a little while, almost like a cathedral rather than a dining hall. Edith herself plays a little, though by her own modest assessment nothing like as well as tonight's guest, and there is a phonograph as well, a relatively recent novelty by the standards of this particular year, kept in a smaller sitting room, occasionally wound up in the evening for guests curious to hear this strange new technology reproduce music without a single living musician anywhere nearby, a marvel that still strikes most visitors this particular autumn as something closer to a parlour trick than a genuine household fixture, though within another decade or two it will have become entirely ordinary in homes across the country. Sometime after 2 in the morning, a light rain begins outside, the first real weather of the night, soft against the windows of the rooms facing the gardens, a sound gentle enough that it barely disturbs anyone's sleep and might, for a few of the lighter sleepers in the house, actually deepen it, the particular hush that rain brings to an already quiet building. Down in the gardens themselves, it will do some quiet good, softening soil that has gone a little dry over the past week, and Thomas the gardener, when he wakes before dawn to begin his own day, will likely notice it immediately and feel a small private satisfaction about it, the kind of satisfaction available only to people whose work depends directly on weather they have no real control over. The rain does not last long, gone again within the hour, leaving behind just a faint dampness on the stone terraces and a slightly heavier, richer smell of wet earth drifting up from the gardens whenever a window happens to be cracked, which none of them currently are, but it passes through the story anyway, a small unremarked event, the kind of thing that happens constantly in any house on any given night, and that nobody ever thinks to mention specifically, except that we happen to be paying close enough attention tonight to catch it. I want to give Emily King, the housekeeper, a proper turn in this story too, before we finish, because she has appeared throughout tonight mostly through her effects, a room finished ahead of schedule, a vase adjusted twice on a mantel, a notebook carried on evening rounds, without much said yet about who she actually is underneath all that visible competence. She is older than most of the other staff we have met tonight, in her late 40s this particular year, and she came to domestic service the way many women of her generation did, starting as a housemaid herself decades ago in a considerably smaller household, working her way up through years of increasingly responsible positions until Biltmore, still under construction at the time, offered her the position of housekeeper, an enormous professional leap that she has, by every available account, more than justified in the years since. She never married, a common enough circumstance for women who rose to senior positions in domestic service, since the demands of the job, particularly at Emily King's level, left little room for the kind of household of her own that marriage would have required managing alongside her professional duties. Within the household, she runs the female side of the staff with a combination of genuine warmth and absolute exacting standard that her staff, Ruth included, both slightly fear and deeply respect in more or less equal measure. She knows every one of her housemaids by more than just their name, is aware, in the quiet way a good manager stays aware of such things, without ever making a show of it, of which girls are homesick, which ones are saving towards some particular goal, which ones might need a gentler word on a hard day, and which ones respond better to being simply left alone to work through whatever is troubling them privately. This is not written anywhere in her job description. It is simply, over the years, what the job has actually required of her, alongside the linen counts and the cleaning schedules and the endless small logistics of keeping a house this size running to a standard that satisfies both her own considerable pride in the work and Edith Vanderbilt's expectations, which, while high, are nowhere near as exacting as the ones Emily King holds for herself. Emily King retires for the night herself sometime after midnight, later than most of her staff, in a small but comfortable set of rooms near the housekeeper's office, a modest private sitting room attached, one of the few genuine perks of her senior position, a space entirely her own within a house where privacy, for most of the people working in it, is a fairly scarce resource. She keeps a small collection of books there herself, nothing like George Vanderbilt's library, but enough for her own quiet evening reading, and there is something rather lovely, I think, in imagining the household's two most dedicated readers, master and housekeeper, both closing their respective doors on roughly the same late hour, both settling into a chair with a book for a few private minutes, before finally allowing themselves to sleep, in two very different rooms that nonetheless share, in their own small way, exactly the same purpose. If you had asked Emily King, at the end of a day like this one, whether she considered her work satisfying, I suspect she would have given you a fairly practical answer, something about a job well done and a house properly run, without much flourish or sentiment attached to it. But I think there is real pride underneath that practicality, the particular satisfaction of genuine mastery, of knowing that a house this complicated, this demanding, this constantly poised on the edge of some small crisis or another, ran today, as it runs most days, without a single guest ever noticing that anything required managing at all. That is not a small achievement. It is, in its own quiet, unglamorous way, a kind of art, the kind that never signs its own name to anything it makes, and never asks to. The chef deserves his own moment too, before we close things out. A man whose full name appears in almost none of the household's surviving records, the way George and Edith's names appear everywhere, and yet whose daily judgment shaped the family's experience of this house as intimately as almost anyone else working within it. He trained in France, in kitchens considerably more prestigious and considerably more brutal in their internal discipline than anything Biltmore's own kitchens quite managed to replicate, an apprenticeship that began in his early teens and that instilled in him both extraordinary technical skill and a temperament that his kitchen staff have learned, over time, to work around carefully, respectful of his genuine talent and wary, in more or less equal measure, of his occasional explosive dissatisfaction with a dish that does not meet his own considerable standards. The small disagreement about trout we mentioned early this morning was by his standards actually a fairly mild one. Sarah and the other kitchen maids have witnessed considerably more dramatic culinary crises over their time here. A sauce declared unfit and thrown out entirely, rather than served with any imperfection. An entire course reworked at the last possible moment because the chef decided, sometimes with only minutes to spare, that his first instinct had not done justice to the ingredients in front of him. And yet for all his temperament, he is respected genuinely by the staff beneath him, because his standards, however exhausting to work under, produce results that even the most demanding guests consistently praise, and because he is, underneath the occasional explosion, generous in his own way with knowledge, teaching techniques to his kitchen maids that most of them would have had no other opportunity to learn, treating the kitchen, in his better moments, less as a strict hierarchy and more as a kind of ongoing apprenticeship that happens to also produce 3 elaborate meals a day for one of the wealthiest families in America. He retires late tonight too, well after the scullery maids have finished and gone up, reviewing tomorrow's menu one final time the way he always does, adjusting a planned dish slightly based on what he expects the morning's deliveries from the dairy and the garden to actually bring him, because a truly good chef, he would tell you if you managed to catch him in an expansive enough mood to discuss his own philosophy, never quite finalizes a menu until he has seen with his own eyes what the day is actually offering him to work with. It is nearly 3 a.m. now, the deepest, stillest part of the night, the hour when a house this size feels most completely, almost eerily, its own true scale. Every fire we have mentioned tonight burns low or has gone entirely to embers. Every bell sits flush against its board. Every corridor, upstairs and down, public and hidden, sits in near total darkness, broken only by the occasional low lamp left burning for safety's sake near a staircase, or the faint steady glow from the winter garden where that fountain continues its patient endless circulation, the one sound in the entire building that never actually stops. If you stood, right now, in the very center of the entrance hall, in the almost total dark, and simply listened, you would hear almost nothing at all. Not silence exactly. A house this large and this old, even at only a few years old, always carries some faint structural murmur, wood settling, the distant hum of machinery 2 floors below your feet, but something close enough to silence that it presses on your ears in its own particular way, the specific, heavy quiet of an enormous space built for hundreds of people, currently holding only a handful of them, all of them asleep, all of them, for these few hours, entirely unaware of the house continuing to exist around them, unaware of the chef's late menu adjustments, or Walter's late-night errand, or Emily King's small private hour with her own books, unaware of nearly everything we have spent tonight learning about the world, running quietly beneath their comfortable, effortless rest. I never got a chance tonight to take you down to the basement's recreational wing, and I think it deserves a mention before we finish, because it surprises most people the first time they hear about it. tucked away below all that formal grandeur upstairs. Biltmore was built with its own indoor swimming pool, heated, tiled, lit by electric fixtures along the walls, a genuine rarity in a private American home at the turn of the century, along with a small gymnasium fitted with exercise equipment of the era, and a bowling alley, 2 lanes, built purely for the family and their guests' amusement on evenings when the weather outside made the gardens and the riding trails less appealing. None of this saw use tonight. The current guests inclined toward quieter pursuits, cards and conversation, and an evening at the piano, but on other visits, other weeks, this basement wing fills with laughter and splashing, and the particular clatter of bowling pins, an entirely different register of entertainment than anything happening in the banquet hall or the salon, playful in a way the more formal upstairs rooms rarely allow themselves to be. The pool sits empty and dark tonight, its surface perfectly still, catching a faint gleam from a single low-security lamp left burning nearby, and there is something almost strange about a swimming pool, in complete silence and complete stillness, water that exists purely to be disturbed, currently undisturbed by anyone at all, waiting. Upstairs, one more room deserves a proper mention before we close the story out. A smaller, cosier space just off the main family quarters known simply as the oak sitting room, panelled floor to ceiling in dark oak, a fireplace of its own, comfortable chairs arranged for reading or quiet conversation, functioning as a kind of private family living room distinct from the grander, more public salon downstairs. This is where George and Edith actually spend a good portion of their genuinely unstructured time together, away from guests entirely, a cup of tea and a shared newspaper in the evening, or, on quieter nights than tonight's, simply each other's company and no particular obligation to entertain anyone at all. It is a small room by the house's own standards, and I think that smallness is rather the point. Even inside 250 rooms, a family still needs one that belongs to nobody but themselves. The guest bedrooms themselves each carry their own particular character, named informally by the household staff, and sometimes by the family too, after the art or furnishings that distinguish them rather than by simple numbers the way a hotel might organize its rooms. There is a room dominated by a striking portrait attributed to the school of Van Dyck, hung prominently enough above the fireplace that guests staying there for the first time nearly always comment on it within their first evening, the subject's painted eyes seeming in flickering firelight to follow you gently around the room in the particular way old portraits sometimes do. There is another room furnished almost entirely in a style associated with Louis XV, delicate gilt furniture and pale silk upholstery, considered one of the more elegant, more feminine rooms in the guest wing, and reserved, by informal but consistent household custom, for female guests of particular importance. And there is a smaller, cosier room known among the staff as the Tyrolean chimney room, its fireplace surround carved in a rustic alpine style entirely different from the French elegance dominating most of the rest of the house, a small deliberate variation that keeps the guest wing from feeling monotonous even across dozens of individually grand rooms. Tonight's 2 guests occupy 2 of these named rooms, though I have not specified which, mostly because it hardly matters to the story we have been telling, and because I think there is something nice in simply knowing that every guest room in this house carries its own small distinct identity, its own particular furnishings and history and character, rather than existing as interchangeable, identical accommodations the way a modern hotel room so often does. A guest at Biltmore did not simply sleep in a bedroom. She slept in the Van Dyck room, or the Louis XV room, or the Tyrolean chimney room, each one carrying its own small, specific identity within the larger house. There is a music room too, planned into the house's original design, though its full furnishing and decoration will, in fact, take considerably longer to complete than most of the rest of the house. Some of it not finished at all during George Vanderbilt's own lifetime, a reminder that even a project as meticulously planned as this one was never quite finished, never quite arrived at some final, static state of completion. A house this size, it turns out, is less a single achievement than an ongoing project, rooms still being decided upon, furnishings still being sourced, years after the family first moved in on that Christmas Eve back in 1895. There is something almost comforting in that thought, actually the idea that even a building this grand, this seemingly complete and permanent, was in fact still becoming itself, slowly, one room at a time, the same way most of our own homes, on a considerably smaller scale, and never quite finished either, always one more project away from some imagined final state that never actually arrives. I think, before we move on from the afternoon entirely, it is worth pausing on something I have circled around all night without ever saying quite so directly, which is the particular kind of dignity that belonged to the people doing this house's invisible work. It would be easy, and in some ways tempting, to tell this story purely as a tale of contrast, luxury above and labour below, and leave it at that, a simple, satisfying moral shape. But I do not think that captures what I actually feel, having spent this much time imagining my way through their days alongside you. Ruth takes real pride in a bed made to Emily King's exacting standard. Charles takes real pride in a cellar organised to his own private satisfaction, regardless of whether any guest ever comments on it. Agnes takes pride in sugarwork most people will consume in under a minute without a second thought. Samuel takes pride in a stable kept immaculate for horses who cannot themselves appreciate the effort. None of this pride depends on recognition from above. It exists on its own terms, rooted in craft and competence, and the simple, durable satisfaction of doing difficult work well, the same kind of pride that exists in nearly any skilled trade, in nearly any era, regardless of who does or does not happen to be watching. That, I think, is the quieter, less obvious lesson sitting underneath tonight's whole story. Not simply that great houses depend on invisible labour, true as that is, but that the people performing that labour were never merely instruments of someone else's comfort. They were, each of them, the authors of their own considerable skill, quietly excellent at difficult, demanding work, in a world that rarely thought to thank them for it, and that nonetheless could not have functioned, not for a single day, without them. Let me take you back, for a moment, to that afternoon tea in the winter garden, because I moved through it fairly quickly earlier tonight, and I think the food itself deserves a slower look, the way food so often does in a story like this one, small physical details that tell you more than any general description of wealth ever quite manages. The sandwiches Charles's footman carried in on that silver tray were cut into precise, small rectangles, crusts removed entirely, fillings chosen for delicacy rather than substance, thin cucumber laid between bread spread with a whisper of butter, a little watercress, something faintly peppery, and a second variety built around finely minced ham, bound with just enough butter to hold together without ever threatening to be heavy. A plate of small scones followed, still faintly warm from the kitchen, split and offered with clotted cream imported at real expense, and a dark, slightly tart preserve made from berries grown somewhere on the estate's own grounds earlier in the summer and put up in jars specifically for occasions exactly like this one. The tea itself came from a blend the household kept specifically for afternoon service, poured from a silver pot polished that same morning by hands in the butler's pantry, into cups thin enough that light passed faintly through the porcelain when held just so against the window. None of this was accidental. Every element of that tray, from the precise dimension of the sandwiches to the specific preserve chosen to accompany the scones, reflected decisions made somewhere down the household's chain of command, the chef weighing in on what complemented the kitchen's current stores, Emily King ensuring the presentation met her own exacting standard, Charles confirming, with a single glance before the tray left the pantry, that nothing about it would embarrass the house in front of a guest. An afternoon tea that appeared, to Edith and her friends sitting comfortably among the ferns and palm trees, like the simplest, most natural thing in the world was, underneath that appearance, the product of a small committee's worth of careful decision-making, executed so smoothly that neither woman gave it a second thought beyond simple, uncomplicated enjoyment. I mentioned earlier tonight how deliberately the approach road conceals the house until the last possible moment, and I want to give that particular piece of design one more slow pass, because I think it deserves to be felt rather than simply explained. Imagine the carriage today carrying that early arriving guest up from the Asheville train station, the horses settling into an easy rhythm along 3 miles of curving forest road, trees pressing close on either side, the occasional break in the canopy offering nothing more than glimpses of sky and distant ridgeline, no hint whatsoever of the enormous structure waiting somewhere ahead. And then, quite suddenly, the trees fall away entirely, the road opens, and the entire facade simply arrives, all at once, stone and spire and steep roofline catching the afternoon light, so much larger and so much more immediate than anything the winding, deliberately unrevealing approach had prepared you to expect. Visitors, even now, years into the house's existence, still occasionally gasp audibly at that moment, and Olmsted, elderly and largely finished with his career's major work by the time this particular effect was finally realized, considered it one of the most successful pieces of landscape theatre he had ever designed, precisely because it works on nearly everyone, regardless of how much they already know to expect it. The butler himself has gone unintroduced throughout tonight's story so far, and that feels like an oversight worth correcting now, in this last stretch before we finally close the house down completely. His name is Charles, and he came to this position after years of service in prominent New York households, recruited specifically for Biltmore on the strength of a reputation for exactly the kind of unflappable, formal competence that a house of this scale and visibility demanded. He carries himself with a particular stillness that younger footmen, Walter included, have spent considerable effort trying to imitate, a stillness that comes, Charles would probably tell you if pressed, not from any natural calm but from years of careful practice at appearing calm, regardless of what is actually happening underneath the surface. He held the wine cellar key we mentioned earlier tonight, and the silver safe, and a whole ring of other keys besides, small unglamorous objects that nonetheless represented, in their totality, an enormous quantity of quiet trust extended to one man by a family that could, if they chose, have hired virtually anyone in the country for this position. He takes that trust seriously in the specific, undemonstrative way that people who have spent decades in formal service tend to take such things seriously, without much visible sentiment attached to it, simply an unwavering, daily commitment to doing the job correctly, whatever correctly happens to require on any given day. Edith's involvement with the wider community around the estate, which I mentioned earlier tonight, would grow considerably in the years following this particular visit, has in fact already begun in small ways even now, this early in the family's life at Biltmore. She has taken a personal interest in several families living within Biltmore Village, visiting occasionally, informally, in a manner that some of her more socially rigid New York acquaintances might find faintly unusual for a woman of her standing, bringing small gifts for children, checking in on a family whose husband was recently injured in an accident on the estate grounds, quietly arranging for a doctor's visit to be covered without ever making the gesture feel like charity extended from a great height. This impulse, still relatively small and informal tonight, will eventually grow into the substantial civic and philanthropic work that defines much of her later life. But even now, in these early years, the underlying temperament that will eventually produce that larger legacy is already visibly present. A genuine, practical concern for the well-being of the people whose labour makes her own life possible, expressed in small, unglamorous, unpublicised acts rather than grand gestures. George's relationship with his own library deserves a slightly closer look too, beyond simply noting how many volumes it holds, because the habit behind that collection says something particular about him. He corresponds regularly with booksellers in New York, and occasionally in London and Paris, maintaining what amounts to an ongoing, carefully managed acquisition project alongside everything else the estate demands of him, requesting specific editions, sometimes specific translations, of works ranging from classical literature to contemporary novels to serious works of history and natural science. He keeps, as I mentioned earlier, a running list of every book he finishes, and by several accounts from people who knew him, he read something in the range of 80 to 100 books in a typical year, an extraordinary pace for a man managing an estate of this scale and complexity, achieved largely through exactly the kind of quiet, protected morning and evening hours we have watched him claim for himself today, the 40 minutes after breakfast, the hour after dinner with an old friend that somehow always finds its way back around to whatever he happens to currently be reading. He favours landscape architecture and horticulture, unsurprisingly given the scale of what he has built around this house, along with history, particularly European history, and a fair amount of contemporary fiction as well, not simply the respectable classics a man of his position might be expected to display, but genuine current novels, purchased and read within months of their original publication, suggesting a reader driven by real curiosity, rather than by any need to appear appropriately cultured. There is something almost touchingly ordinary in that. A wealthy man reading the latest popular novel purely because he wants to know what happens in it, tucked into the same reading habit that also produces careful, serious study of forestry management and Italian Renaissance architecture. The approach to the house itself looks different depending on the season and the weather, and I think it is worth imagining, for a moment, how differently tonight's two guests might have experienced that same 3-mile winding road under different conditions than the mild autumn afternoon that actually greeted them. In heavy summer rain, the forest closing in along the road takes on a deep, saturated green, the sound of the carriage wheels changing entirely on wet gravel, the first glimpse of the house when it finally comes, softened by mist rather than sharpened by clear light. In winter, snow transforms the whole approach into something closer to the fairy tale European landscape the house's architecture already gestures toward. Bare trees, white fields, the limestone facade rising pale against an equally pale sky, in a way that makes the entire estate feel, for a few months each year, considerably closer to the original French inspiration Richard Morris Hunt drew from than it does during the lush greenery of a Carolina summer. There is one last small thing I want to leave you with before we let the fire have the final word, and it is simply this. Every grand house you have ever heard of, every palace, every mansion, every sprawling estate whose name gets attached only to the family who owned it, held some version of this same hidden world inside it. Dozens of hands, mostly unnamed, mostly unremembered, doing exactly this kind of quiet, patient, essential work through the night so that morning could arrive looking effortless. Biltmore is simply the version we happened to spend tonight inside together, but the shape of it, fires lit before anyone wakes, water made hot before anyone asks, silence maintained so completely that the labor itself disappears, repeats itself across nearly every great house history has ever bothered to remember by name alone. One more household routine deserves mention before we finish, something that happens on a much slower cycle than anything else we have followed tonight, which is the periodic deep cleaning that a house this size requires, beyond the daily maintenance Ruth and the other housemaids perform. Several times a year, entire rooms are effectively taken apart and reassembled, curtains taken down and beaten free of dust or sent out for proper cleaning, carpets rolled up and carried outside to be beaten across a line strung specifically for the purpose, furniture moved away from walls so that corners and skirting boards neglected during ordinary daily cleaning finally get their turn. This work falls disproportionately on the housemaids, an exhausting few days each season that Emily King plans with almost military precision, assigning specific rooms to specific staff on a rotating schedule that ensures the entire house gets its turn, without ever taking so many rooms out of commission at once that the family's daily comfort suffers. Chandeliers are lowered, piece by delicate piece, for individual cleaning of their crystal drops, a task requiring such careful handling that only the most experienced staff are trusted with it. Tapestries, including the ones hanging in the gallery and the banquet hall, receive occasional specialist attention from experts brought in from outside the household entirely, since cleaning several hundred-year-old woven wool and silk is not a skill any general domestic training prepares a person for. Ruth has been through this seasonal cycle enough times now that she has her own private opinions about which rooms are the worst to draw, the banquet hall's height making its upper reaches a genuine physical challenge even with ladders, versus which rooms are by comparison almost pleasant, smaller guest rooms with less elaborate decoration that can be turned out properly in an afternoon rather than several exhausting days. She has learnt, too, the particular satisfaction of a room freshly deep cleaned, walking back through it afterward and seeing, in a way that daily maintenance never quite achieves, the full, restored brightness of a space properly, thoroughly cared for, even knowing that within a matter of months, ordinary use and ordinary dust will have begun, quietly, to claim it back again. I never gave you a proper look inside Cornelia's nursery earlier tonight, beyond the socks and the too small rocking horse, and I think it deserves a slower pass now, in this final quiet stretch, because a child's room tells you things about a household that the grand formal spaces simply cannot. The nursery sits bright and cheerful, wallpapered in a soft pattern of climbing vines and small birds, chosen specifically to be gentler and less imposing than the darker, more formal patterns used throughout the rest of the house. A low shelf runs along one wall holding a small library of her own, picture books and simple readers, some in English and a few in French, since Edith has already begun, even this early, arranging for her daughter to grow up with more than one language comfortably available to her. A dollhouse sits in one corner, elaborate enough that it might, on a smaller scale, remind you of the very house it sits inside. Tiny furniture arranged room by a child who has apparently developed strong opinions about where the miniature dining table properly belongs. A basket of blocks, a small tea set, porcelain, a scaled-down echo of the china locked carefully away downstairs in the butler's pantry, used most afternoons for elaborate imaginary tea parties that her nurse and, when she has the time, her mother are regularly commanded to attend. Her nurse, English, hired specifically for her experience with young children of exactly this social standing, maintains her own careful daily schedule for Cornelia, meals at consistent hours, a nap in the early afternoon that Cornelia increasingly resists as she grows older, a bath each evening before bed, conducted with a great deal more splashing than strictly necessary. There is a gentleness to this whole small world upstairs, tucked away from the more formal machinery of the household below it, that I find genuinely lovely to sit inside for a moment, a reminder that underneath everything else this house represents, wealth and architecture and ambition and legacy, it is also quite simply where a small girl is growing up, learning her letters, arguing about socks, hosting tea parties for an audience of stuffed animals and one extremely patient nurse. Down below, the walled garden deserves one more visit too, before we close things out completely, because I only passed through it quickly earlier tonight, mentioning gardeners and cut flowers without really giving you the space itself. It sits below the house on a gently sloping site, enclosed by brick walls that hold in warmth and shelter the plantings from mountain wind, laid out in formal geometric beds that, come spring and summer, fill with an almost overwhelming variety of flowers, roses especially, along with vegetables grown in a working kitchen garden tucked into one corner. Less picturesque than the ornamental beds, but every bit as carefully tended. A rose garden sits just beyond the walled garden proper, and beyond that, greenhouses, including the one that supplied tonight's cut flowers, kept warm year-round through the same kind of careful engineering that heats the house itself. Thomas, the gardener we met briefly cutting flowers this morning, has worked these grounds for several years now, trained originally in England before making the considerable journey to America for a position that offered him, among wealthy American estates of the era, one of the more genuinely interesting horticultural challenges available, a chance to work alongside the tail end of Olmsted's own direct involvement, learning firsthand from a landscape architect whose reputation even then was already considered close to unmatched in the entire country. He takes real pride in this garden, walks it most mornings before his official work even begins, simply to see how everything is coming along, and there is a particular satisfaction he feels, he has mentioned once or twice to the other gardeners, in knowing that flowers he personally selected and cut will end up, by evening, sitting on a table where George and Edith Vanderbilt themselves will notice them, even briefly, even without ever knowing his name. He keeps a small notebook of his own, tucked in his coat pocket most days, recording which beds bloomed well this season, and which struggled, informal notes toward next year's planting, that nobody has ever asked him to keep, but that he maintains anyway, out of the same quiet professional pride that seems to run through nearly everyone we have met inside this story tonight, upstairs and down alike. Before the men settled into the library tonight, they passed briefly through a smaller room set aside specifically for the after-dinner ritual of cigars, a custom considered, in this era, unsuitable for the dining table itself, and equally unsuitable for mixed company more broadly. This room is smaller and more masculine in its decoration than almost anywhere else in the house. Dark leather chairs, heavier fabrics, a particular lingering smell of tobacco worked into the upholstery over years of exactly this same nightly ritual. George keeps a small selection here, nothing extravagant by the standards of wealthy households of the era, and he and Barrett each take one before wandering on toward the library proper, continuing a conversation that had already begun somewhere over dessert and would not really conclude until well past 10. A footman waits nearby throughout this brief interlude, ready with a light and with nothing else required of him beyond simple, quiet availability, one of the more curious small duties within the household's overall structure, an entire job that consists mostly of standing ready in case a small, specific need arises, and otherwise simply existing, patiently, in a room's corner, present but unobtrusive, the particular skill of being visible only exactly when needed and invisible every other moment in between. Let me linger a little longer over the dinner conversation itself too, because I moved past it fairly quickly earlier, and there was more to it than the single dry joke I mentioned. Talk drifted, as it tends to at a table like this one, through several unhurried subjects across the length of the meal. A little news from New York that Barrett had heard before leaving, Margaret's own gentle account of recent goings-on in Asheville, a passing discussion of a book that had apparently caused something of a stir in certain literary circles that season, George offering an opinion on it with the particular confidence of a man who has in fact already finished it, while several of the guests around the table have only heard second-hand accounts. Edith steered the conversation gently whenever it threatened to settle too long on any single subject, a hostess's quiet skill redirecting attention toward whichever guest had spoken least recently, ensuring nobody at her table ever felt entirely left out of the evening's flow for very long. There was talk too of tomorrow, the walk through the gardens contingent on weather, and perhaps, Margaret suggested, a small excursion further out along the estate's carriage roads if the afternoon stayed fine, out toward one of the more distant overlooks where the forested ridgelines roll away in layers toward the horizon. A view George never tires of showing to guests, seeing it for the first time, quietly proud, in a way that has nothing to do with ownership exactly, and everything to do with genuine attachment to a landscape he has spent years shaping with his own careful, patient attention. I want to return briefly to that contrast I mentioned early on between breakfast and dinner, because I think it says something worth dwelling on a little longer about how this family actually wanted to live, underneath all the formal architecture built to suggest otherwise. The breakfast room itself, distinct from the cavernous banquet hall, is a considerably smaller, sunnier space, morning light pouring in through tall windows, decorated with a lightness and warmth that stands in deliberate contrast to the more imposing formality found elsewhere in the house. This was, in a very real architectural sense, George Vanderbilt building himself permission to start each day gently, a room specifically designed to resist the grandeur that dominates so much of the rest of his own house. That contrast extends to the estate's communication systems too, which I touched on only briefly earlier tonight. Beyond the annunciator bells connecting guest rooms to the servants' hall, the house maintained an early telephone system linking various points around the estate, the main house to the stables, to the gardener's office, to a handful of other outbuildings scattered across the working portions of the grounds, sparing estate staff the considerable time that might otherwise be spent simply walking messages back and forth across acres of property. It was a genuinely modern convenience for its era, installed not for show but because George Vanderbilt, ever curious about efficient systems, recognized how much friction a good communication network could remove from the daily coordination of an operation this large and this spread out. I want to give Agnes, the pastry cook, one more proper moment too, because her dessert tonight, the one carried in with its own small ceremony after the meat course had been cleared, represented the single longest continuous stretch of work performed by any one person in the entire kitchen today. She began it, in truth, before lunch, a delicate construction of choux pastry and cream and spun sugar that required not just skill but an almost obsessive attentiveness to timing, sugar work in particular being notoriously unforgiving of distraction, a single moment's inattention capable of turning a carefully controlled caramel into a scorched, unusable mess that would need to be started over entirely. She works largely alone in her separate pastry kitchen, cooler and quieter than the rest of the kitchen complex by deliberate design, and there is a particular kind of solitary concentration to her craft that sets her apart even from the other kitchen staff, closer in temperament, in some ways, to George Vanderbilt himself in his library than to the louder, more collaborative bustle of the main kitchen just beyond her door. When her finished dessert finally left her hands this evening, carried out by a footman toward the dining room, she allowed herself only a brief moment to watch it go, before turning immediately to tomorrow's preparations, a professional habit that leaves little room for lingering over any single triumph for very long. Charles and Emily King, the butler and the housekeeper, maintain a working relationship that outsiders sometimes mistake for rivalry, given how firmly each of them guards their own separate domain within the household, but which is, underneath that formal division of labour, something closer to a genuine, if understated, partnership. They meet briefly most mornings to coordinate the day's larger logistics, today's early guest being exactly the kind of matter requiring quick, calm cooperation between the two of them, Emily King handling the room itself, while Charles ensured the necessary adjustments to tonight's dinner service moved forward without friction. There is real mutual respect underneath their formality, two people who each recognize, better than almost anyone else in the household, precisely how much skill and discipline the other's job actually requires, even if neither of them would ever say so quite so plainly out loud. Edith's friend, the one who arrived early this afternoon and set off this whole day's small flurry of extra preparation, deserves a proper introduction too, since I have referred to her tonight only as an early arriving guest without ever quite making her a person in her own right. Her name is Margaret Ashford, from an old and reasonably prominent Asheville family herself, someone Edith met not through the usual New York social channels but through the estate itself, in the years since the Vanderbilts first settled in this region, a friendship built on genuine local connection rather than inherited social obligation. She is a few years older than Edith, widowed young, and has become over time one of the small handful of people Edith can speak to with something close to complete honesty, unguarded in a way that even a lifelong friend from her earlier New York circle might not quite manage, precisely because Margaret's own life has given her a particular, hard-won understanding of both privilege and its limits. It was Margaret's letter that arrived this morning, informing Edith of the changed travel schedule, and it is Margaret now sleeping soundly in the Van Dyke room, or perhaps the Louis XV room, whichever it turned out to be, in a bed prepared hours ahead of the original plan by a household staff who executed the whole small crisis so smoothly that she likely has no idea any crisis occurred at all. Tomorrow, over that promised garden walk if the weather holds, the two women will talk the way old close friends talk, about nothing in particular and everything at once, and Edith will likely mention, in passing, how relieved she was that the room came together so easily, never quite registering, or perhaps simply choosing not to dwell on, just how much quiet effort that easy outcome actually required. Let me take you back into the rotisserie kitchen for a moment, into the heart of tonight's dinner preparation, because I moved through that scene rather quickly earlier, and it deserves a slower, more sensory pass. The heat in that room by late afternoon is considerable, close and thick, radiating off the open fire beneath the turning spit, and the smell fills not just the kitchen itself but drifts, faintly, into the corridors beyond it, rendered fat and browning meat, and a particular smoky sweetness that develops only in the final hour of a long, slow roast. The kitchen boy tending the spit has rotated the same joint of meat, by hand, for the better part of 3 hours by the time it is finally judged ready, basting it at careful intervals with a long-handled spoon, his forearm aching in a way he has long since stopped consciously noticing, sweat beading along his hairline in the close heat even on a mild autumn afternoon. When the chef finally pronounces it done, testing it with a practiced eye and a quick press of his finger rather than any thermometer, there is a small, satisfied exhale that passes through the kitchen, not celebration exactly, simply the release of tension that comes when a task requiring hours of careful, unglamorous attention finally, successfully concludes. I never properly introduced the older gentleman staying through the week, the one who eventually joined George in the library after dinner, and I think he deserves a small proper mention before we finish, because his presence in this story, however brief, says something about the particular kind of friendship George Vanderbilt valued most. His name is Charles Barrett, unrelated to the butler despite the shared name, an old university friend of George's from years before Biltmore existed at all, a man who has gone on to a quiet, respectable career of his own in New York, not nearly so wealthy as his host, but comfortable enough and connected to George by something considerably older and more durable than money, a genuine decades-long friendship built originally on a shared enthusiasm for books that neither man has ever really outgrown. He visits Biltmore perhaps twice a year, always for an extended stay, and George, by every account from those who have observed the two of them together, is visibly more relaxed in Barrett's company than in almost anyone else's, a man who can simply be himself, argue happily about a novel's ending or a historian's questionable conclusions, without any of the careful social calculation that governs so much of his other daily interactions. Their conversation in the library tonight, the one that ran a full hour past when the women had already moved on to quieter subjects in the salon, circled eventually around a recently published work of history that both men had been reading independently, George pulling a competing volume off the shelf at one point, specifically to read a passage aloud that he felt contradicted the newer book's central argument, the two of them going back and forth for a good 20 minutes with the easy, good-natured combativeness of men who trust each other completely and therefore feel no need to soften their genuine disagreements. This is not a friendship built on flattery. It never really was, even decades ago, back when they were younger men, without any of the responsibilities either of them now carries. And I think that particular quality, an old friendship immune to the distorting effect of George Vanderbilt's enormous fortune, is precisely why he treasures Barrett's visits as much as he does. I want to take you out to the stables one last time before we close things out, because I left that part of the estate rather quickly earlier tonight, and there is a quiet nighttime version of that world worth visiting too. The head groom, a weathered, soft-spoken man named Samuel, who has spent more of his life around horses than around people, by his own cheerful admission, makes a final round of the stalls sometime after 10 each night, checking water, checking that each animal has settled properly, running a hand along a flank here and there, simply out of habit as much as necessity. George's own favourite mount, a bay gelding with a calm, steady temperament that suits its owner's own unhurried riding style, nickers softly when Samuel passes, and Samuel pauses for a moment, the way he always does, to rest his palm against the horse's nose before moving on down the row. There is a lantern burning low in the tack room, where bridles and saddles hang in careful rows, leather kept supple with regular oiling, brass fittings polished to the same exacting standard Charles applies to the silver inside the house, because Samuel takes the same quiet pride in his own domain that Emily King takes in hers, a pride that has nothing to do with anyone upstairs ever noticing it, and everything to do with simply doing the work correctly for its own sake. He sleeps in a small room above the stables tonight, as he does most nights, close enough to hear if anything in the barn below him requires attention before morning, a different kind of watch than Walter's inside the house, but built from the very same underlying instinct, the readiness to be needed at any hour without complaint. Samuel has worked with horses since he was a boy, apprenticed on a farm not far from here before Biltmore existed at all, and there is a settled, unhurried confidence to everything he does around the animals, a lifetime of accumulated understanding that no amount of formal instruction could have taught him nearly as thoroughly as simple, patient, repeated practice. Back inside, in a long, narrow storage room off the servants' hall that most guests never learn exists at all, Emily King keeps her linen inventory, shelves upon shelves of sheets and pillowcases and towels and tablecloths, each category organised by size and quality, and folded with a precision that borders on the mathematical. She conducted her own quiet count of this room's contents just yesterday afternoon, a task she performs regularly enough that she could likely recite the current totals from memory, and it was this exact careful accounting that let her respond so immediately and so calmly when the note arrived about the early arriving guest, because she already knew, without needing to check twice, that the household held more than enough properly aired linen to furnish an additional room on short notice, without any strain on the rest of the house's supply. This is the sort of invisible foresight that made her so quietly indispensable, an entire crisis avoided not through any dramatic last-minute scramble, but through the patient, unglamorous discipline of always already knowing exactly what the house has, and exactly what the house might need. I want to circle back one more time to that first Christmas, back in 1895, because I only touched on it briefly earlier tonight, and I think it deserves a fuller telling before we finally let this house rest. The house was not fully finished that December, not by any reasonable definition of finished. Entire wings still lacked furniture. Some rooms had barely received their final plasterwork, and yet George Vanderbilt gathered his family anyway, mother, sisters, cousins, refusing to let the builder's schedule dictate when his own life inside this place would actually begin. Workmen were still on site during that first holiday gathering, in fact, tucked away in unfinished corners of the house, while, elsewhere, a household staff still learning its own new routines scrambled to make the finished portions feel as warm and welcoming as possible for a family arriving to celebrate Christmas somewhere they had genuinely never lived in before. That first tree, some 35 feet of it, was cut from the estate's own forest and hauled into the banquet hall by a team of workers using a system of ropes and pulleys, since no ordinary means of moving a tree that size through a doorway, however grand, was going to suffice. Candles rather than electric bulbs lit its branches that first year, actual open flame, watched over constantly by staff specifically assigned the nervous task of making sure 35 feet of dry evergreen did not catch the entire half-finished banquet hall on fire during the family's very first Christmas inside it. Gifts were exchanged beneath it, modest by the standards this house would eventually come to represent, since the family itself was still finding its footing in these new, enormous surroundings, still learning, in a sense, how to actually live inside the dream George Vanderbilt had spent nearly a decade building. Every Christmas since has echoed that first one in its broad shape, the same tree, cut from the same managed forest, hauled into the same hall, though electric lighting long ago replaced the nervous candle watch, and the household staff, no longer new to their roles, now execute the entire elaborate production with a confidence and polish that first improvised holiday could never have managed. Emily King, even now, months before the coming December, has already begun the quiet mental accounting that will eventually become a full holiday preparation, which guest rooms will need extra attention, how many additional staff might need to be brought in temporarily to manage an enlarged household through the season, whether this year's tree, already growing somewhere out in Pinchot's carefully managed forest, has been marked yet for cutting. There is something rather moving in that continuity, I think. A single tradition, born out of one impatient man's refusal to wait any longer to live in his own finished home, repeating itself now year after year, growing steadier and more polished with each repetition, the way most family traditions do, until the rough, improvised, slightly nervous version of that very first celebration has become, through nothing more than patient repetition, something that now feels as though it had simply always existed, exactly as it exists tonight, timeless, effortless, entirely itself. It is nearly 4 in the morning now, and if that hour sounds familiar, it should, because that is precisely where we began this story together, a full day and a full night ago, Sarah on her knees in front of a cold iron range, working ash out with a small metal scoop. And here is the strange, quiet truth of a house like this one, the thing that took me longest to fully understand while learning this story well enough to tell it to you tonight. That exact scene is about to happen again. There is one more thought I want to leave you with before we return to fire itself, and it concerns time, or rather the particular way a house like this one seems to hold several different scales of time inside it all at once. There is the scale of a single day, the one we have followed together tonight, hour by hour, from Sarah's cold range at 4 in the morning to another maid's fresh flame at nearly the same hour a full day later. There is the scale of a single year, the seasons turning through the gardens and the forest, autumn easing toward the Christmas tree already being imagined months in advance, and there is the much longer scale the house itself seems built to gesture toward, the 4 centuries of French architectural tradition Richard Maurice Hunt borrowed from, the tapestries already 300 years old when they were first hung on these walls, the entire elaborate performance of permanence staged by a family whose own American fortune had, at the time this house was built, existed for barely 2 generations. All 3 of those timescales sit inside this one building simultaneously, the daily, the seasonal, and the borrowed aspirational centuries the architecture itself pretends to already possess. I think that layering is part of what makes a place like Biltmore feel the way it feels, even now. even to someone who has only spent one imagined day and night wandering through it alongside me. It is a house built to seem as though it has always existed, inhabited by people keenly, constantly aware that it has not, going about their very ordinary days, their sock disputes and their trout disagreements and their quiet evening cigars, inside a stone shell built specifically to make all of that ordinary daily life feel, somehow, timeless. I want to spend a final moment on something that has run quietly through nearly every scene we visited tonight without ever getting its own proper attention, which is fire itself. The dozens of separate hearths scattered through this house, each one carved differently, each one tended by different hands, and yet all of them, in their own way, telling the same story. The fireplace in George's bedroom, dark carved wood framing it, warmed the room where he woke this morning. The one in Edith's sitting room caught the candlelight that moved so gently across her wallpaper before she finally slept. The one in the library holds two men's easy conversation long after most of the house has gone quiet. The one in the banquet hall, largest of them all, sits banked to embers now beneath a chimney breast, carved with the same careful attention as everything else in that soaring room. Each of these fires was laid by someone whose name we will likely never fully know, built with kindling gathered and split by someone else entirely, from wood cut, in turn, from a forest managed with a seriousness that helped invent an entire branch of American conservation. A single fire, warming a single room, turns out to connect, if you trace it back far enough, to nearly everything else this story has touched tonight. The forest, the household hierarchy, the quiet invisible labor threading through every hour of this long day and night. I find something almost beautiful in that, the way one small ordinary thing, a fire in a hearth, holds an entire world inside it if you are willing to look closely enough. Tonight's gathering, small and quiet as it turned out to be, is a fairly modest affair by the household's own broader standards, and I think it is worth imagining briefly what the same rooms look like when the occasion calls for something considerably larger. When Biltmore hosts a genuine ball, the preparations begin days in advance rather than hours. The banquet hall's full-length table extended to something closer to its true capacity, additional temporary staff brought in from Asheville to supplement the household's regular numbers, an orchestra arranged well ahead of time rather than a single guest at the piano, and Emily King's careful planning stretched to its absolute limit as she coordinates rooms for dozens of overnight guests, rather than the handful currently sleeping upstairs tonight. Flowers alone, on such an occasion, might require the greenhouse and the walled garden working at full capacity for days beforehand, every vase in the house pressed into service, arrangements considered and reconsidered until Edith herself is satisfied that each room strikes exactly the right note. The scale of coordination required for an evening like that, hundreds of small decisions multiplied across every department of the household at once, makes tonight's minor scramble over one early arriving guest look, by comparison, almost restful. And yet the underlying principle never changes, whether the household is managing one unexpected guest or 50 expected ones. Anticipate everything, show none of it. Let the evening simply seem to happen beautifully on its own. I asked you, right near the beginning of tonight's story, how a house containing 250 rooms and dozens of employees and countless fires and meals and outfits and guests could possibly appear to function without effort. I think we have spent enough time inside this house now, together, for the answer to feel obvious rather than mysterious, though it was not obvious at all when we started. It functioned effortlessly because effort itself was simply relocated, moved out of view, distributed across dozens of hands working in kitchens and pantries and attic dormitories and stable lofts, each of them handling one small piece of an enormous coordinated whole, timed so precisely and practiced so thoroughly that the seams between all those separate small efforts became, to anyone standing on the other side of them, entirely invisible. There was no single trick to it, no one machine, no one system. However clever the annunciator board or the elevator or the telephone line running out to the stables, it was simply people, an enormous number of them, each trained to anticipate rather than merely react, each trusted with some small piece of the larger illusion, working in a kind of quiet, practiced concert that most of them would never have described using a word as grand as illusion at all. To Ruth, to Sarah, to Emily King, to Charles. This was simply the work. It only looks like magic from the other side of the door. Out past the walled garden, in the thin, uncertain light just beginning to gather along the eastern edge of the mountains, the first birds are starting their morning calls, tentative at first, a single voice testing the air before others gradually join in, building slowly into the fuller dawn chorus that will, within the hour, fill the grounds around the house with sound. None of the household hears it yet, not really, not consciously, though several of them are close enough to waking that the sound may be threading its way, faintly, into the last stretch of their sleep, shaping the particular quality of a dream without ever quite becoming a fully conscious sound. The dairy cattle, somewhere out past the formal gardens, are beginning to stir too, and within the hour a small team will be out among them, milking already underway well before the house itself shows any sign of waking, one more invisible piece of the enormous quiet machinery that keeps this entire world turning. Somewhere below us, in the servants' hall, another young kitchen maid, not Sarah herself tonight, since even the hardest working households understood the value of rotating this particular earliest shift among several different girls, rather than asking one person to rise at 4 every single morning without relief, is already stirring in her narrow attic bed, woken by an internal clock trained over months of this same early rising, pulling on her uniform in the near total dark of a room she shares with 2 others who will not need to wake for another hour yet. She moves quietly down the back stairs, the same stairs Ruth and Sarah and Dora and dozens of others have worn slightly smooth over the past several years, past the sleeping household, past the closed door of the butler's pantry where the silver waits, gleaming faintly even in darkness, for tomorrow's use, past the scullery where every trace of tonight's dinner has long since been scrubbed away and put back in its place. She reaches the main kitchen, and she does exactly what Sarah did yesterday morning, and what some kitchen maid or another has done every single morning since this house first opened its doors on that Christmas Eve years ago, and will keep doing for years still to come. She kneels in front of the cold iron range, works the ash out with a small metal scoop, lays kindling with the same practiced, unhurried care, and strikes a match. Once the fire finally catches, a small orange light blooms in the dark kitchen, throwing soft moving shadows up across the walls, warm and alive against the cold stone, and somewhere above her, 3 floors up, in a room with dark wood panelling and a view, come morning, of gardens and mountains beyond, George Vanderbilt sleeps on, entirely unaware that his day has, in the most literal sense possible, already begun without him, the same way it began yesterday, the same way it will begin tomorrow, and the day after that, for as long as this house continues standing, and this particular way of living continues to exist within it. I think this is the right place to leave our story tonight, right here, at this small quiet moment of renewal, a single fire catching in an enormous dark kitchen while an entire household, upstairs and down, sleeps on around it, mostly unaware, mostly at peace, mostly simply trusting, in the deep unconscious way that trust becomes habit, that everything will be exactly as it should be when they finally open their eyes. Because that is, in the end, what this whole story has really been about, more than anything else we touched on tonight, more than the architecture or the acreage or even the family's own names, not the tapestries, though they are beautiful, not the 250 rooms, though the number itself is genuinely staggering, not even George and Edith and Cornelia, though I have come, across the course of tonight, to feel a real fondness for all 3 of them, one that goes beyond simple historical curiosity. It has been about this instead, this quiet, patient, endlessly repeating act of care, performed by dozens of hands whose names mostly never made it into any history book at all, so that a handful of people they served could wake up every single morning to a world that felt entirely and convincingly like it had simply always been that way, effortless, warm, ready, without a single visible trace of everything it actually took to make it feel that way at all. Somewhere outside, past the still dark gardens, past the sleeping stables, past thousands of acres of Olmsted's managed forest just beginning, ever so faintly, to lighten at its edges as the first hint of dawn approaches from somewhere far beyond the mountains, the house sits exactly as it always sits at this particular hour, dark from the outside, silent from the outside, giving nothing at all away about the small orange fire now burning quietly in its deepest kitchen, or the young woman kneeling in front of it, or the entire vast, patient, invisible machinery already turning over, once again, beneath 250 sleeping rooms. Sleep well, friend. Wherever you are tonight, I hope the fire in your own small corner of the world is warm enough, and I hope, unlike the family sleeping soundly inside these walls, you at least got to hear, this once, the sound of someone quietly lighting it for you. Rest now. Morning will look after itself, the way it always does, the way it always has, one small fire at a time, one quiet hand at a time, one ordinary act of care at a time, repeated so faithfully for so long that it has come to look, from the outside, like nothing more than simple, effortless ease.